Hey everybody, this is Rex Bear with Leak Project. I hope you're having a nice day today. We've got Douglas Dietrich on the show with us, and for 4 hours, Douglas is just nonstop information. It's a little bit different in this presentation. We've had him on the show several times in the past. Douglas is definitely an incredible whistleblower that has so much intel. If you listen to him talk for an hour, it'll definitely change some part of your reality, most likely. Now, for 4 hours, literally, there is just no stop button on Douglas. He gets into information from ancient biblical scriptures, and we discuss the Christ, we discuss Christianity, and Christmas. Now, I gave him my interpretation of Christmas now being a consumer-driven, consumer-oriented holiday. You know, if you don't got $5,000 in the bank to go spend on Christmas presents for your friends and family, well, if you're married or have a significant other, they might be upset and disappointed and depressed because they don't feel like they're meeting the requirements of Christmas. So is it Xmas or is it Christmas? If you haven't heard of Douglas before, check out his website, doubledietrich.com, if you enjoy what he has to say. Also, our website, leakproject.com. We have a ton of exclusive content on leakproject.com, and we have over 400 full-featured podcasts available for free at youtube.com/clandestine timelord. Have a fantastic day, everybody, and be the change you want to see. I did want to bring one thing to your attention today. The radiation levels, at least here in San Antonio, Texas, are 0.16 microsieverts per hour. That is substantially higher than it is regularly out here. Now, as I told you guys before in the past, the radiation levels used to hover around 0.07 microsieverts per hour in 2013. That's where it stayed consistently, and it's been a slow increase over the past few years since then. Right now, we're at 0.16 microsieverts per hour. 0.16. Man, it's tough to see that. There we go. 0.16 microsieverts per hour. Now, is that an extremely high amount of radiation? No. But for this area, it is. And it's been jumping to this level frequently. I don't know if you guys have any insider information on maybe there's something going on out there in Carlsbad, New Mexico, a nuclear leak of some sort, because there is a whole bunch of stored radiation out there. Maybe there's something in the San Antonio area that I don't know about. I don't really think it's Fukushima particles. It could be. But let me know what you guys think, and have a fantastic day. All right, well, we have a real treat for you tonight, folks. We have Douglas Dietrich with us again from DietRich.com. Douglas, it's great to have you on the show here with us, The Leak Project. How the heck are you?
Doing much the better for speaking with you, my dear friend. And I consider you a brother in spirit, and I'm very glad to be with you, if not in spirit, which I believe we are certainly here together in terms of standing side by side and exploring spirituality tonight. We may not be together physically, but we're certainly together electronically via Skype. And I'm hoping that we can go a bit into the spirituality of the Yuletide season, what's behind it, what I feel is misunderstood about it, and I'd like to emphasize that which is positive among a lot of the negativity that, of course, I'm exposing per force of circumstance.
Absolutely. And isn't it amazing how just things work when you end up bumping into somebody that you haven't talked to in 3 years, 5 years, or whatever, then you start working with them again and stuff. It's just fascinating. You know, it's like synchronicity, energies working together, the universe working in harmony. And I do think that it's an absolute blessing that we've got you on the show with us, and I've learned so much from you over the years. I know many of our audience members have as well. Now, Christmas to me, I look at it with so many benefits and so many good opportunities. It seems like nowadays, at least here in America, when I think of Santa, I think of Satan. You turn the two letters around and you look at this corporatocracy world that we live in now. It's all consumer driven. If you don't have $5,000 to spend on your family for Christmas, well, then your spouse or significant other is going to feel upset and have a emotional difficulty with the situation. Some people are so attached to giving stuff to other people and trying to meet those parameters that I feel personally, in my opinion, they really lose track of what Christmas should be and was maybe founded upon. So when I say Satan, Santa, I mean, is that some type of weird spin that this I don't know, whoever it is that kind of controls the scenes behind the scenes said, "Oh yeah, well we're going to take this entity that and this holiday that should be good and towards giving to others and turn it into our own personal agenda," if that makes sense.
I understand what you're saying. Where I believe that perhaps there might be a demonic drive would be in the commercialism or the commercialization of Christmas. That's something that not many people will argue with, and I think it's something that a lot more people are beginning to protest. As a matter of fact, it's universal enough where we've had some black rappers in the past that produced some of what I thought was brilliant satire, where they're rapping in dedication to all of the parents who are driven to poverty by this season. Basically, songs like "Here Comes Fatty with a sack of shit," for Santa, coming down through the loo and whatnot. And it's one of those things where obviously it's tiresome and even noisome to the degree that somebody feels obligated because their children are driven to expect something. And I feel ashamed for the period of time when I was a child and expected to an extent what something at this time of year. Obviously, part of that conditioning. Of course, my family, I grew up in abject poverty, and the miracle was that they managed to give me anything at all. And what they gave me, of course, is incredibly precious. And certainly as you grow older, you learn to value what is beyond the material. And of course, you go through a phase like I did, where you try to, of course, collect some of the materials that you couldn't have when you were a child. And there's nothing wrong with that. I believe that it's never too late to have a happy childhood. And so as adults, there's nothing wrong with catering to that inner child and perhaps catching up on collectibles that you did not get but wanted as a child. So we're not going to, or we shouldn't, condemn that aspect of ourselves, condemn our inner child. Rather, what is more in context is just learning to value, of course, what is behind Christmas. I'm hoping that we will get to that tonight in great depth, perhaps even painful depth. But in terms of Santa Claus himself,
No pain, no gain.
yes, yes. In terms of Santa Claus himself, to contextualize Santa Claus, the original visions of Father Christmas were rather different. They weren't necessarily something that is the Santa Claus we envision today, which is the jolly fat man in the red suit who's got the long white beard. That image was actually very much creation of the Coca-Cola company. So the original Santa Claus of Europe, of ancient European tradition, was more of a kind of a obviously Caucasian old man with a white beard. But he wasn't all dressed up in the red skin-tight fur pajamas with the waist belt. He was basically somebody who was perhaps even frightening looking to children today. This was, of course, coeval with the spirit or the concept of Knuckles. And Knuckles was, of course, the demon who came to punish bad children. And so you had basically the good cop, bad cop kind of scenario throughout medievalist Europe that was recently commercialized. By recently, I'm talking about literally maybe about just prior World War II. I mean, Coca-Cola has not been around that long. We're talking about Coca-Cola might have been around in the 1800s, and so in the very early 19th century, and they didn't develop the Santa character until maybe the 1900s, early 1900s, around World War I or World War II. And so the Santa, as we've come to know him, is very much a commercial creation. So it's no surprise that he's basically like Uncle Sam, basically saying, "I want you to buy, and bring all the kids to sit on my lap because I'm going to tell them, that they can get what's on their list." And so it's all part of that, and it's specifically American, very important to emphasize, which had a veneer of capitalism. I say veneer because obviously there's no such thing as capitalism. It's one of the things I think we should start off with, just very briefly, because we've had a potential victory, and I say potential, of the candidate. I'm still calling him a candidate. Donald John Trump. And I'm not
I'm
saying
still in
this.
shock.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we all are. We all are. Well, he's in shock. I mean, he honestly didn't expect it because he was talking about literally playing the part of the bad loser, and many of his followers were talking about coming civil war, armed resistance, revolution if he did not win.
Let me jump in
And
real quick. I'm glad
please.
you brought that up because I am thinking of what would be a better way to start a civil war than put somebody like Trump in office, get him elected, and then all of a sudden say, oh, nope, it was the Russians that did it. They hacked the system, so they're the ones that got him in office, so now we're going to have to put him in prison, and Hillary is your new president. Welcome to America, land of the free. Yeehaw!
Well, it's funny that you say that. He's been handed presidential security briefings on the assumption that he needs to be debriefed before he potentially enters office, and he has refused to read them. Now, what do we get from that? I mean, there's several things we can assume. I mean, one of them is that his reader is Ivanka, and she doesn't have a security clearance. Or we can assume that he basically is planning on resigning literally as soon as he enters the Oval Office and handing the office over to his vice president, who does read the security briefings, by the way, as opposed to Donald Trump. And so it's a bizarre situation already. It's not normal. And there's no professional president or any president who's trying to at least convey a veneer of professionalism who has ever done that. The problem with his supporters, of course, is such that they're irrational in their exuberance. And they would say, of course, well, he's too great a man to be reading security briefings. But that's part of the scope of the problem that we're dealing with, is basically we've had a electoral college victory for Donald John Trump. Honestly, in terms of the popular vote, it is indisputable that Hillary Clinton did win by a vast majority, a vast landslide. As a matter of fact, she won by such a landslide in terms of the popular vote that she has won more votes in terms of majority than any other president of the United States in recorded history, other than President Barack Hussein Obama, who, of course, was never legally president because he was never born in the United States. So aside from that, however,
that was another psyop they used against us. They said, okay, well, guess what, you guys? He's not really from America, and we know that that's not allowed according to the Constitution, but guess what? He's your president anyway.
Yeah, there was that. I mean, and of course, the arch conservative, or rather reactionary foreigner by the name of, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had campaigned for years to have them amend the Constitution so that he could become president, of course, was rolling over in his steroid-infested grave, even though he's still alive, mind you. He's kind of walking dead in the sense of all the tumors he probably got from all the steroids he's injected himself with over the years. He's muscular in every part of his body, including inside of his cranium.
Have you seen his recent pictures?
I have not, fortunately. I'm sure they look quite haggard.
He's juicing big time. Big time.
Does that mean drinking as an alcohol? Yeah.
No, juicing as in like steroids. Yeah, okay. I mean, you look at his, that's definitely not natural.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, and well, I mean, I'm not really sorry. I mean, it couldn't happen to a nicer guy. I mean, we suffered his gubernatorial, shall we say, regime over the state of California for far too long, and I could go on and on about his shortcomings. I was shredding documents for the state of California at the time, based on, of course, my experience with incinerating documents for the federal government. So while I was taking care of my parents and advocating for them as a care provider, my night job was to interstate buildings with a key and then shred documents. Now, the beauty of it was I was theoretically on contract. As a matter of fact, functionally was on contract. So I didn't need to go in at specific times. I basically had the keys, went in at various hours, took care of enormous loads of work. So I didn't have to be doing this every night of the week, but it took up enormous amounts of hours that I would clock in. And of course, I was exposed to all kinds of documentation dealing with the governance of the golden state of California. And certainly horrible things were done. The first thing he did to save money was when he became the governor was he ordered all of the animal shelters to kill every single animal and shut down. And I leaked it. I leaked that, as I did many government scandals. And what happened was the animal rights activists, particularly the PETA organization, went into high gear, and they shut down his evil scheme. But this was somebody who had no care for animal life. He certainly had no care for human life. He made a killing in the basically the grave industry, where he was, of course, leasing lots in the state of California. And, to give you some example of this, what it's like in California, how much of a ripoff it is to bury somebody. Both of my late and sainted parents were buried in upstate New York. And, of course, the price I had to pay for that, and we're talking about, upstate New York, people have been living there for hundreds of years. You'd think it'd be chock full of bodies and prices would be at a premium. But it cost me about $300 maybe in terms of just the grave, the lot for the grave. To bury my parents. And obviously it costs far more than that when you add the coffin liner, which is required by law, the coffin itself, etc. Some poor dope I knew whose mother had died buried his mother in the state of California in an equal plot. By that I mean nothing that was in a fancy cemetery per se, even though, like mine, it was in a cemetery. It was on cemetery grounds, obviously, or it would be illegal. It would be like, burying a body that you murdered if it weren't like that. So he was on the cemetery plot, and it cost him $17,000. And I said, dude, for that level of money, you could have gone to upstate New York and had yourself a shopping mall massacre with a machine gun, killed about 24 people, and buried them all in a mass grave for that amount, for what you spent to bury your mother. And so that's the kind of money source of income that we had with Arnold Schwarzenegger. He got into the graveyard industry and was juicing people for burying their relations. He's one of the reasons why people started cremating so heavily and so enthusiastically. I mean, so that's something to be said about him. And that brings us to the spirit of the season and how we have to differentiate that from nationalism, or rather American identity, specifically, because what I'm going to get into may, of course, upset people in terms of basically turning their paradigms on their heads about Christianity and where it sources from, and why, of course, Christianity is a universal religion, and why it's a tolerant religion, and why the concept of evangelical missionary work is a moot point. It's obviated by the reality of Christ and Christianity in and of itself, based on historical context, the reality of actual writings of the early Christians. And the early Christians, of course, came long before Christ, which is misunderstood by many Christians today, who remain in ignorance due to a number of layers in terms of Bible interpretation. So we'll get into that as tonight. But one of the biggest problems with Americans is, of course, they conflate Christianity with the Founding Fathers. Now, I was originally just recently interviewed by a friend of mine, Michael Basham, and he is going to be on my program next Tuesday. The gentleman who will be on the Tuesday after that is going to be a gentleman named Rex Bear, who I'm talking to tonight, of the Leak Project. And both of these men will be on critical omissions, which is my topical Tuesday night program. So
how do they find critical omissions, Douglas?
How do they fund it?
How do they find it?
How do they find it? Oh, thank you. I thought you were talking about how's the station managed.
No. You guys are doing really good, and you told me about the numbers that you get, and that's phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, it's still, we always want to maintain a sense of modesty, but it is incredible how much more influential we have been becoming over the years, as is the Leak Project. And so we are definitely cross-pollinating, and we want to support each other's audience. So I want the reviewers, the viewers of the Leak Project, to know that they can find myself on Tuesdays and Saturday nights at freedomslips.com. Just enter it with a keyboard, www.freedomslips.com, from Freedom's Lips to your ears. And on freedomslips.com on Tuesday nights and Saturday nights, 10 to midnight Eastern time, you'll be able to hear myself, and that'll be 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Pacific. Of course, our good friend Rex Bear is in Texas, so in terms of Central Time, that's going to be 9 to 11 p.m. at night or so. Yeah, 9 to 11. And he'll be with us the Tuesday after next Tuesday. And so everyone can look forward to that being placed into YouTube video format by Rex Bear. And that, of course, will go up on my own Facebook timelines. And I do want people to visit my Facebook timelines as well as those of Rex Bear and the Leak Project. He doesn't work with Facebook as heavily as I do, but I work with Facebook pretty heavily. And you'll find me at facebook.com facebook.com/www. Or is it www.facebook.com/Douglas Dwayne Dietrich, and that's where you'll find my public community fan page. Douglas is spelled with one S. Dwayne is spelled D-U-A-N-E. My middle name. Dietrich, you just spell it the way that Rex Bear pronounced it. Diet Rich. Dietrich. And so www.facebook.com/Douglas Dwayne Dietrich, all in lowercase, all one word. And you can also personally friend me on my personal friends page, which is the same beginning, www.facebook.com/Douglas D. Dietrich. And that's where you'll find my personal friends page. Rex Bear, of course, can give his own addresses for his Facebook timelines if he wishes. But like I said, you haven't taken too much advantage of Facebook, and I think I guess there's some reasons for that. You're heavily involved with the YouTube, and that's where it works for yourself, right, Rex?
Well, yes, and with what's going on with YouTube right now, it's just so much energy, time into just YouTube. Now that I'm actually going to be working with a manager here pretty soon that's going to be able to take a lot of my chores essentially that I'm doing myself, and then I can focus more on the shows again. And then that way we're going to be doing multiple shows a day, kind of like we were a while ago, 2, 3, 4 shows a day. And then we'll just get on all sorts of topics. So yeah, absolutely. Now, another thing that I'm thinking about too, Douglas, is we've known each other for, about 6 years now. And, we've never met personally, but we've done some great interviews together. And if I really looked at how many hours of knowledge that you've given us, whether it's here or the other platforms that I've been with, it's like 30 hours, essentially. I mean, it's a lot of information. We're talking encyclopedias of knowledge that even 1 hour of knowledge with you, just the way that you talk and the information you bring to the table, could be 24 hours with somebody else. So it's literally paradigm shifting every time that we talk. And you have so much information on off-beaten topics, clandestine knowledge, the Christian religion. It seems like if you look at it from the biblical standpoint, I see so many contradictions there and so many mind control type tactics. What do you think about the current version of Christianity compared to what you're referring to and the original archetype of Christ?
Well, I think it's important to differentiate where we're coming from on that, or to qualify where we're coming from. And you bring us back, of course, to what's happened in the United States. What happens in the United States sources in terms of the history of this perversion of Christianity, and it is a perversion, out of England. One could say it started with the formation of churches, but it's very important to remember how important the churches are. In America, there is a kind of incredible infantilism, because America is one of the youngest cultures in the world, if not the youngest culture in the world. And as the youngest culture in the world, what America has is a infantilism, and it's pervasive in the sense that, like an infant, Americans think in terms of absolutes. And as people who think in terms of absolutes, they are, by adult definition, insane. When an adult behaves as an infant, I mean, not just in a childlike manner, but in an infantile manner, when they're just literally crapping their pants and expecting other people to change their pants for them, when they're sucking on teething rings or the equivalent thereof, at that point, they're not considered a competent adult. They are institutionalized. The overwhelming majority of Americans function pretty much at that level. level in a manner of ways, one of them being their ability to interpret metaphor or much of what is the Bible. Not that the Bible is entirely metaphorical, but that brings us back to the churches. The churches served a very important purpose in the sense that when Christianity began to basically explode in a universal sense with the coming of God himself in the form of Christ, when that did happen, this miraculous event, this world-changing event, there had to be a way to contend with that. And the early Christians fell into two major groups in the West. And I use that term, the West, very loosely. I'm using it with what is geographically Southwest Asia. What is known as the Levantine or the Holy Land to the American mindset, meaning the Middle East, as referred to by geographers. And when Christianity emerged as a major world-changing force in that area out of centuries, thousands of years, perhaps even well over 1 million years of quietude and peace keeping in terms of its being kept in an almost cult-like status by a very select group of people that we're going to go into tonight in terms of the sage kings who visited the Christ child. When it emerged out of their honoring the Christ himself, who came in long after they were aware that who came into our world long after they were aware that he was coming. Then what happened at that period of time was the Christians in that area, the converts in that region of the world, fell into two major groups. One was those that were obsessed with gnosis, meaning knowledge, meaning a personal communion with the divinity, and those that were obsessed with pistis, meaning faith. And pistis is, of course, the foundation of the church. Now, the original church, or the oldest form of it, was Byzantine Orthodoxy, what we would call Byzantine Orthodoxy, because ultimately the Emperor of Rome himself converted to Christianity, Constantine. He relocated the capital of the empire, which was very much in disarray and collapsing, to what became known as Byzantium, what was originally named after him, Constantinople. And in Constantinople, of course, we had the combination of Christianity with the Roman military create a barrier of defense against heathendom, and the establishment of Christianity as an empire was born. And of course, with that came a formalization, a dogmatization of belief, of necessity, because an empire must run on laws, it must run on rituals, it must run in the Confucian sense. And my original, of course, cultural matrix, my entire foundation for my reality is based on Confucianism, over which, of course, Christianity adds spirituality. What the best way to express it would be that Confucianism is my politics, and my spirituality is Christianity, which is entirely, of course, potential with Confucianism, because Confucianism is not a religion in the sense that it is demanding the worship of a particular god. It is not a theistic religion. It is a religion, but it is a religion without a god, as is, of course, Buddhism. People in Christianity who don't understand these theological differences might imagine that Buddhists worship Buddha. Okay, that's not the case. Buddha was a prophet who introduced a way of life, a way to overcome the wheel of karma and dharma and suffering and enlighten oneself and ultimately Yeah, please.
I wanted to jump in on Buddha because I talked to somebody before that said Christ actually talked and wrote about Buddhists' teachings and spiritual path. Is that true?
Oh, he may well have. That's a matter of interpretation based on the archaeological evidence that we have. But it's very important to know that Christ was missing for a very long time in what are called the missing years. Essentially, Christ spent the majority of his life on earth. That means God, the Son of God himself, and the personification of God. We are talking about somebody who is more than just Hercules, because Hercules was the son of a god in the concept, in the way that Hercules was understood.
Now,
so we have someone. Yes, go on.
Now, was Yahweh, in your eyes, is Yahweh the original God, the Alpha, the Omega, the Almighty, the All-Knowing?
And you ended there, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was waiting. I had a feeling you were going to ask
superlatives.
me that.
The,
Yes,
the,
I was ending there.
yeah, and so yes, he is, of course, and he is not in the sense that that we will get into, which is the problem is that most Christians conflate the God of the Old Testament, the God of Abraham, who is a tribal God, with God. And God, the divinity, the universal, who encompasses all of the superlatives that you articulated, and particularly the superlative that's most important, which is being beyond time and space, outside of time and space, which is, of course, a creation of God. That God is not the God of the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament is very much a tribal God. So we'll get into that. These identifications of these cultural matrices, which kind of turn God into something that he is not, the God, as opposed to, say, for instance, the God of Abraham. Now, nevertheless, Jehovah, as it's Anglo-bastardized, which of course is originally Yahweh, which is just again, very much a bastardization. The pronunciations in the original Hebraic are unutterable. They are unutterable because God's name is not really meant to be spoken or vocalized. The best that men can do is basically try to ape it with the vocal cords that we are provided. It's a divine name. It cannot be vocally spoken. So what we do is we utter a simulacra of the name. This is the whole element that I have brought up before, though we're not going to go in that direction that everybody is obsessed with, which is the calling of the anti-gods. They are named by barbarous names, which means their names are literally unpronounceable. Now, you enter a word about the tetragrammatron or various other kinds of symbolic languages, and these are useful. Yes, these are useful in terms of getting closer towards the naming of God. People who become monofocal or obsessed with that are, in a very real sense, missing the point. That's not something that's necessary for the knowledge of an average layman. Does the average layman need to be able to disassemble and reassemble a firearm in order to fire it? No, you just point it and you shoot. Does the average layman need to know how to disassemble and reassemble a vehicle before you drive it? In this day and age, it would be almost impossible. Your average mechanic couldn't do that because most vehicles are electromechanical. They're no longer mechanical appliances. In the past, a man could work on a vehicle. He could bring it into his private garage. He could make a hobby of reassembling cars. Okay, you can't do that anymore.
You just brought up a huge point, Douglas, and I'm sorry to interrupt. You're hitting on so many things, and I want to interject here. Everything is becoming compartmentalized to the point to where nobody's going to be able to do anything without somebody on the other side of the world that knows how to interject. I mean, that just was an epiphany for me, and it makes me realize how in danger our system really is. If it seems to me like, because if you really think about it, there's literally 6 corporations that control the media. There's 6 corporations that control the majority of the textbooks and knowledge in the education system. There's a few corporations that control the majority of the pharmaceutical companies. So it's so compartmentalized on a global scale, yet if you wanted to build a phone, are you going to be able to build that smartphone? Are you going to be able to put together those conductors and those circuits? And even if you could, do you even know how? Like for me personally, I felt like I had a win the other day because I've got an old Samsung phone that the power button essentially got stuck. So I had to look on YouTube how to take off the power button to keep my phone to turn it on again. And now I've got this pain in the ass phone, but I don't have to sign another contract because I was able to take apart the phone, take off the power button, and now plug it into my computer. To make a long story short, there is no way that I could even find out if that thing broke totally, which semiconductor or which chip worked or didn't work to be able to even find out what was going on. So what happens if, an SHTF scenario really goes down and people don't have access to their technology? I mean, it would be utter chaos. It would literally be the Walking Dead on steroids.
Yeah, well, we're going to have that eventually at some point because complex civilizations inevitably collapse because of their complexity. The people who are using those smartphones that you speak about are speaking more and more gibberish to each other in what would be a pidgin kind of text language that has nothing. Yeah, that literally has nothing to do with language as it was originally spoken or written. Very few people learn cursive writing anymore. They don't teach cursive writing in schools, and so you can't really sign a signature that's in cursive that differentiates your signature from other people. So we're back down to thumbprints and writing X. I mean,
Isn't that terrible?
Well, of course it's terrible, and it's exactly what the majority of Americans unfortunately deserve because they aren't investing time in educating their children to carry on a complex civilization with the nuances of what is civilized. People don't understand that these are not simply ritualistic. They're not empty. These skills of cursive writing and the rest of that, they develop parts of the mind that you need to actually mentate or process the thought. And so when children are denied that, they cannot think, literally cannot think. One of the biggest issues is, of course, innumeracy. Innumeracy is numeric illiteracy. Now, in Japan, China, and Russia, we have great examples of cultures that maintain numeracy. And to be numerate, to be numerically literate, means that in Japan, they use what's called the soroban. In China, they use what's called the abacus. Now, these look alike as bean counting machines to your average Westerner. They're not. They're entirely different systems of, shall we say, bean counting. And in terms of the Japanese soroban, you have like one top strip that's separated from the rest. And in the abacus of China, you have two. And but in their different fashions, the Japanese and Chinese mentate differently. They process numerically differently, but they're learning to process numerically. And in Russia, they use the slide rule. And still today, they learn to train with that. They don't use calculators in schools, or at least they did the last time that I checked, which was admittedly a decade or so ago. But that was at a time when their schools still forced people to use the slide rule to learn to process numerically the way the Chinese and the Japanese used the abacus and the soroban. Now, because of this, Russians, Chinese, and Japanese think. They actually mentate. Americans do not. They have no process for, they're not capable of rational thought, literally not capable of rational thought. And this is why it's
not
so
all
easy
Americans. Don't get mad at Douglas, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes. No, but let me qualify that. Just because someone like, say, for instance, Rex Bear, and I'm going to assume many of his viewers are people who listen to myself on Revolution Radio through freedomslips.com. Just because you have people who are seeking a different, shall we say, source of information and seeking out new knowledge does not mean that they can process it. See, that's the problem. This is why we still have so many people who listen to what I have to say, and they feel it's just one voice amongst many others. And that other people who come on, anybody else who comes on and says there's blue avians orbiting above the Earth, or somebody else who comes on and says that, I've got God talking to me, directly. Okay, people like this, they automatically assume are saying, well, that's on the same level as Douglas Dietrich, and basically I can pick and choose what I want. It doesn't work like that. That's like saying you have you're trying to build a aeroplane, and because you want to build an aeroplane, you can just select parts from anything you want. Vacuum machines, you can take them out of a car.
Haven't you seen MacGyver?
Well, there you go, right? I mean, that's part of the insanity of it. I mean, MacGyver is supposed to be. He's very much an exception to the rule because MacGyver is supposed to be basically the ultimate survivalist. What he is he's someone who is an expert at ad hocery. He's taking he's assembling what we would call Rube Goldberg machines, which are meant to work once. They're meant to work once. That's it. He's getting out of a jam, right? He's not building something that you're ever going to fly again. He's taking like toy compartmentalized like models from real big radio controlled airplanes airplanes that people would use to radio control or something like that. And he assembles enough of them, he makes a real airplane to get out of a spot once, right? It's not something you're going to use again. So that's like a situation which is presented to you as an inspiration for intuitive improvisation. That's what we would call it, intuitive improvisation. Okay, that is very different from building something that is going to last and work again and again. And so Americans are, in general, yes, incapable of that with what they're trying to put together as a reality frame. So what I'm telling you is that, no, you can't just pick and choose like that. And what's that the equivalent? What that's the equivalent of is, of course, basically assembling something that is going to kill you the moment you take off in it. And of course, that's what happens with these Americans when they try to take off in their assembly. If they were trying to apply what they've cobbled together to a reality framework, it's going to crash and burn. And so that's why I have to be this shall we say, definitive about it. Because if I'm not that definitive, then I am remiss. I am actually irresponsible. So in that sense, what I say, it has to be qualified, has backing of a fact. And therefore, I can say it with the conviction that I say it. Which brings us back to the churches and then ultimately to the conflation of American identity of, say, their sense of patriotism or identity with Christianity, and why these things do not conflate. In terms of what I brought up about gnosis as opposed to pistis, knowledge as opposed to faith, many Americans relate more so to the original Christian Gnostics, the Gnostics, who are basically seeking a direct affinity with God. Well, of course, there are benefits to be had from the Naj al-Madin, from what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are aspects of knowledge which, by the way, I'm laughing because I see something entered in the text about Americans believing the earth is 6,000 years old. By the way, this is primarily an American belief. This is not something that was ever church doctrine. This was not something that was ever emphasized, by the original faith. I mean, most of this level of ignorance, infantilism, developed right here in the United States. So to get back to the beginning of our new calendar, our new calendrical system based on the coming and the death of Christ, what we have is a situation in which the Gnostics, of course, basically sought this personal relationship with God, and they also behaved in very bizarre fashions. They would not accept medications. They would not teach their children to read or write. They would go into behavior patterns at extremes that were literally offensive to describe, the eating of dung or the like, because they felt that these were ways to somehow better commune with the divinity based on individual interpretations that they had. So what you have to appreciate about Gnosticism are aspects of knowledge that are essentially not provided by the church, by pistis, by faith, but at the same time, you don't want to follow the Gnostic path to the extreme where you're a hermit in the desert who's drinking his own urine and basically feeling somehow more superior to everyone else, and that everybody else is going to a hell in a handbasket, and you're the only redeemable soul in the universe. I mean, at that point, your personal knowledge with God has driven you mad. You are at that point thinking that you are smarter than God, that you've somehow outsmarted him. So this is a level of megalomania and insanity that millions of Americans have attained. They've reached this level of madness. And you meet them all the time. You meet them on the internet when they're talking to you.
Oh, yeah.
That they have the answer. Okay,
they're out there. Everybody's an expert, Douglas. Everybody.
Yes. As opposed to what I'm saying, which is based on other people's discoveries on what's been historically vetted. We'll get into that. Now, in terms of what we are, the church. Now, the church, of course, is responsible for many atrocities, and the church, of course, enforced itself. Now, what the church was trying to do for very legitimate reasons, and by the church, I mean the original Byzantine Orthodox Church and the successor churches like the Church of the West, the Roman Catholic Church. These churches conducted crusades, they conducted massacres, they established inquisitions. The Byzantine Orthodox Church is less known for its atrocities than that of the Western Church. that doesn't mean atrocities have not been committed by the Byzantine Orthodox Church in the past, in its crusades and conversions all the way out into Siberasia. And of course, that would be the Russian Orthodox Church, all the way into Alaska, where the first Eskimos, as they were called back then, the correct name for these are the Inuit peoples, the indigenous peoples of the Alaskan region, were massacred by the so-called Byzantine Orthodox Christian Russians who encountered them, who were, of course, many of them were fur hunters, traders, and the Byzantine Orthodox priests were very aggressive in their conversions. And of course, that's why you still have Russian Orthodox churches in Alaska today, which once belonged to Russia. And they've had their share of martyrs, etc. But the reality is these sort of conflicts happen when you have a formally established church. So what's the purpose of it? It serves a spiritual function of basically a police department or a police constabulary. And as serving the spiritual function of a police department or a police constabulary, one of the things that the church does is it monopolizes communication with the divinity. And one of the reasons it does that is for a very legitimate reason, to prevent people like some of the extreme Gnostics that I spoke of that went into insane directions. If everybody is running around trying to discover God on their own, what do you have? You have family groups that are basically behaving in the form of Mansonites. You have countless Manson families. You would have utter chaos, anarchy in the most negative sense. And so to prevent that, the church developed a spiritual doctrine. Now, because of that, they had to, of course, take various texts out of what were the writings of Christianity and say what would be incorporated into the most holy book of the Bible. So many of our original texts were lost, or at least separated, and became what were known as apocrypha. Okay, that is the plural. The plurality is apocrypha. The singular is apocryphon. I will be going in particular into the apocryphon tonight of the message of the Magi, and as was interpreted by the original Christians, some of the early practitioners of Christ that were not part of a organized church, but were not Gnostic extremists. So they were basically what we would call a proto-church in their context, the cultural context. Now, in terms of what this brings to us, of course, is the question of what else was outside of the Bible. Well, in the Byzantine Orthodox or Roman Catholic formalized church nomenclature, this would be referred to as deuterocanonical. It would be deuterocanon, meaning that it's not part of the most holy book of the Bible or wasn't incorporated into it by the Council of Nicaea or the original establishment of the church. Now, before we go on away from the churches, in their defense, as an apologist, as I am a member of the Serbian Orthodox Church, I was converted to the Serbian Orthodox Church under battlefield conditions in what was called a battlefield consecration. So at that period of time, I worked for the Karađorđević dynasty, which is the royal family of Serbia, which has a monarchy in exile. The monarchy in exile was living in London, and they were very interested in what was going on in the Balkan Wars in their homeland of the former Yugoslavia. As a mercenary in their employ, they found it untenable that I would be employed by them were I not a Christian. So I was converted in what's known as a battlefield consecration to Serbian Orthodoxy. So, of course, I honor and respect that church and tradition. And what needs to be said in the defense of formalized churches is that they were the preservationists of what otherwise would have been lost to humanity during the Dark Ages. It was the monastics and the priests of the churches, both Byzantine and Roman Catholic, that maintained libraries, that maintained the art of reading and writing. They would teach the nobility, the kings and the queens, the princess, the princesses, the warlords, the noble knights, how to read and write. If it weren't for these men, we truly would have been lost to an age of total darkness and anarchy in the most negative sense. And when I use the term anarchy, it's in the non-ideological sense, which I have a lot of personal contempt for, to tell you the truth, in terms of people who believe in political anarchy, because political anarchy is based on the naivete that if I agree not to cross the street when these lights are red, and you agree to that, and we're not enforcing it on each other, then we can maintain sustain a society. The reality is that never works because there are plenty of people who are not going to follow that tacit agreement, and what you will get will be perpetual anarchy as opposed to political anarchy. So it's very naive. So I want Rex Bear to jump in right now with his perspective on that and other things, of course.
Yes, please. And Douglas, you're hitting on some good points. Much appreciated. I've often thought about what it would be like if there was, let's just say, no government, and if everybody had the right to do what they wanted to do, essentially according to their own mind. Well, there's going to be tyrants out there. There's going to be thugs. There's going to be people with no conscience. And I certainly think that the law does keep people that have no conscience, sometimes at least, when they feel like they're going to get caught, at least in line. So they're not going to go rob your house, attack you in some way, shape, or form. Yet people like myself, I'm sure you and most people that listen to Leak Project have a conscience, and they're not going to go after somebody because of their own beliefs and how they feel, because they want to be able to go to sleep at night, wake up in the morning, and feel good about themselves. So with that said, I can certainly see why there's laws in play, yet there's so many ridiculous laws out there, so much tyranny. They say that America is the land of the free, yet if you look at it per capita, there's more people in prison than any other country in the world. So I'm trying to figure out how this works. I mean, wouldn't the universal law be, don't tread on me, and I won't tread on you. Don't hurt me. Don't hurt my family. Stay away from my friends and family and do what you need to do. And there's no problems. But why do you have to have all these stupid, ridiculous laws in play that say you can do this, you can do that, you can't do this, you can't do that, oh, this is this way, this is that way, etc.? Shouldn't there be a lot less ridiculous legislature and just go to a system? I mean, what would be the universal system to where people are going to be like, yeah, okay, I'm going to play ball. That sounds good. Or if they don't want to, they have the right to go somewhere else. I mean, there's got to be some universal gives and takes here, in my opinion.
Well,
and freedom is key and paramount. And I'm sorry to interrupt again, but I think that freedom is paramount to an extent. You know, do you have the freedom to go do whatever you want and hurt whoever you want? No. But do you have the freedom to protect yourself, your family, your friends, and want to better your life? Well, yeah, but where does the balance play in there?
Yeah, well, that's part of what we're challenged by with the founding fathers and what was established there in comparison to, say, what developed in Asia. Now, when it comes to culture, of course, I was born in China. The Nationalist Republic of China is reestablished on the island of Taiwan. The Confucianism, the philosophy of Confucianism is, of course, pervasive throughout East Asia. That would mean mainland China, that would mean Japan, that would mean Korea and Vietnam primarily, and the other cultures within their geosynchronous orbit, which would be cultures like Thailand, etc. And all of this Confucianism sources, of course, from Gongzu, and Gongzu was very much a statist. Now, despite the fact that this religion is pervasive through all these cultures, it was the nation state in which I was born, the Nationalist Republic of China, as reestablished on the island of Taiwan, which is actually 100 islands that are under administrative control of one major island, which is almost the size of Japan itself. And belonged to Japan quite literally under Japanese administration for a very long time, from 1895 until about 1950. We have a state religion of Confucianism. It's the only culture in the world which made Confucianism the state religion. Now, so obviously I would be more Confucianist, even more so than most. And because of my background, we don't really have this concept of freedom. My concept of freedom comes from my Christianity, because of God providing the option of free will, which we'll go into, which has to do with discernment. Your sense of discernment will ascertain how you utilize your free will, whether wisely or foolishly. But of course, if God created us to be perfectly functional, then he would never have given us free will. He would have made us like the Borg. And that's where, when you talk about something universal, that's something that we must never aim towards as a totality. We can only aim for that as an ideal that we can try to help, shall we say, realize to an extent that is pragmatic or practical among cultures. There are always going to be different cultures which have a different sense of how reality should be dealt with. And that's good, because the different cultures are what are part of our human evolution, is the conflict as well as the interaction between those cultures. Not just interaction, mind you, in a peaceful sense, such as commerce, such as diplomacy, but actual conflict and war. To dismiss the idea of war and to say that war is something that's bad, and to say that we've got to do away with war, that war is an evil, is not only preposterous, it's actually anti-human. It's actually something that is inhuman, because if we had no war, we would be the Borg. We would be a termitary. We would be just a synthesized whole that would be universally in lockstep, absorbing whatever else we could find. Now, nobody who has any modicum of sanity wants that. So what defines us as human is the fact that we make war. Benito Mussolini, one of the original fascists in the West, and of course, I was born in what is a fascist nation. The Nationalist Republic of China, as reestablished on Taiwan, ultimately became a member of the Axis powers. And of course, this is something that's totally misunderstood by the West because of the propagandization about fascism. They have no concept of what fascism is. And of course, the fascis, from which that term comes from, is a Latin term from the Roman Empire. And of course, that means that as bonded rods, in reeds, around the axe, together we are strong, where individually we are weak and we break. So it's obviously antithetical to the individualism of the Western concept of quote-unquote democracy, which is rule by the mob, the ultimate proletarian dictatorship. And of course, that's proven itself very much a poisonous mass ideology that is on par with communism. Basically, Americans, the American empire, the United States, promotes democracy in the same manner that the communists promoted collectivization, at the point of a bayonet and at the barrel of a gun. They go over to Syria, they go over to Iraq, they go all over the world with armed missionaries to promote democracy. And Americans hear that word and they automatically think, that's good. To them, this is good, which means killing, drone strikes, bombing, everything is good in the name of democracy. Okay, that's what the communists used to say about communism. So that's the insanity of their position. But in terms of fascism, my point being made, it's not an individualist kind of state. And what happens is there is a respect for the state, a worship of the state. And Taiwan, that's taken to an extreme. The state religion is Confucianism. And Confucianism is a combination, if you take a look at Gongsu, the Anglo-bastardized by the term Confucius, Gongsu was a combination of Moses and Machiavelli. He was a combination of Moses in that he was born during a period of warring states in which he was trying to lead his people to a promised land, a more organized state, to eliminate the warring states era that was devastating his nation. And to do so, he had to be Machiavellian. He offered his services as an advisor to the princess of the warring states of his time. And so his religion is extraordinarily pragmatic, and it's based on ultimately worship of the state. So this is what you have in Asia. So my perspective on this is completely different. So what I say is the reality is war is part of the human condition. We want to control war as we would want to control anything from getting out of hand. This is why people develop, our cultures develop the warrior ethic. This is why the Japanese developed the samurai class and caste system. This is why the Chinese developed the Shaolin monasteries to develop the warrior arts amongst people who would not abuse that level of talent and power for violence. This is why, of course, the Germans developed the Prussian Junker system, which, of course, is derided by the West. But the Americans have no equivalent to that. There's no warrior caste or class in America. They have what's called a quote-unquote professional military, which is, of course, based on the frontier army, genocide against the Native Americans. Every war they conduct is a genocidal war. They cannot not conduct a genocidal war because this is a non-professional army. This is not a caste of warriors. They are soldiers. A soldier is not a warrior. A soldier is someone who follows orders. A soldier is not a classic hero in the classical sense, the Hellenic sense that you would get from Greek heroics are tragedies. A soldier is someone who follows orders, and he might be an extraordinarily brave man. You could produce somebody like Audie Murphy, who won the Congressional Medal of Honor, who took on entire armored columns by himself. Okay, this man is, of course, heroic in proportion to the violence he was able to dish out. He is still not a hero in the Homeric sense, as tragic as his life was, because he degenerated into what today we would diagnose as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and basically drank himself to death and died in a plane crash, ultimately influenced by the ravages of both CPTSD and alcoholism. So you have a tragedy there. So this is not a hero in the classic Homeric sense. He is not a warrior. He is a soldier who followed orders to an extent that other people were incapable of carrying out those orders. They couldn't carry out those orders to that superhuman level. But soldiers are not warriors. And therefore, there's a difference between the warrior cultures and what America has got. And what America's based their sense of identity on is individualism and freedom. Okay, that's where we come into the Founding Fathers. Okay, the Founding Fathers, they'll bring us back to them. I've emphasized before, this is the problem with conflating Christianity with the Founding Fathers. Now, Christianity is, of course, very much, in a very real sense, a warrior tradition as well. It has aspects of a warrior discipline to it. And, of course, this doesn't mean that you have the right to go out and crusade in the negative sense and murder people simply to convert them. But it's very important to contextualize the Crusades in that they took place not for that reason, but they took place for what they felt was a genuine security threat to Christendom at that time, which was our first concept of Europe. Prior to any concept of European identity, the only concept we had was Christendom, and Christendom was threatened by the influx of Islam, a very militant religion, which was coming to the fore at that period of time in the world. Now, a purely American religion would be something like Mormonism or the Latter-day Saints Church. This is a American religion which evolved in America. Outside of the United States, it needs to be emphasized. The Mormons had to escape the United States into the frontier. They escaped into the West. And at that time, the frontier west was just that, a frontier. It was a frontier zone that was not incorporated territorially into United States administration or jurisdiction. So they were able to set up a theocracy in the far west outside of the territory of the United States. They literally had to fight a guerrilla war against the United States Army, which was under orders to exterminate them. So people need to take this into account, that you have a warrior tradition within the Mormons. This is why many of them serve in the military. And there needs to be a respect for that in the fact that they were born in blood and fire and evolved in that environment of persecution to survive, and therefore are not to be held in the contempt that Americans hold them in. And it's important to remember that people like Mitt Romney did not represent them. He was a Mino, a Mormon in name only, as opposed to a genuine practicing Mormon. And you can have extremes and degenerates in that religion schismatically splitting off, as you do in any major body of religion. You have Mormons who become fanatical, and what they do is they schismatically break off and they take their woman out into the boondocks. They keep them in cages. This has been discovered with some Mormon cults. And this sort of thing happens where Mormons get to the point where they're violent and killing each other, fighting over women in what would amount to basically polygamous harems. Of course, this is to be held in contempt. Of course, this is to be condemned. But it's important to remember within any complex faith or religion or church, you're going to have evil develop. When the church is developed as spiritual constabularies, like any police department, they are going to experience corruption. And as any police department experiences corruption and you produce bad cops, cops that deal in drugs, cops that rape prostitutes they arrest, cops that are just plain bad, these cops are going to taint the entire police constabulary. Now, no constabulary is ever going to be immune from this, and constabularies need to police themselves, and they also need to have watch groups which police constabularies, citizens watch groups. This is also part of the balance of the church. Now, when the church has gotten to the point where it was all powerful, then corruption could take place that we see the fruits of today with child molestation within the Roman Catholic Church, etc. And at this point, though, there were other factors. There were insurgencies, and one of them was the Alta Vendita. The Alta Vendita was a standing order to the Freemasons to infiltrate and destroy the Roman Catholic Church. Now, this is what brings us back to the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers were all Freemasons, and they were part of a kind of cosmology. I wouldn't call it or dignify it with the term spirituality. That was known as deism. Deism is the thought that God has created a clockwork universe, a mechanistic universe, and essentially left it untended. That God is gone. God is dead. That is deism. So all of your founding fathers, all of them, were deists. These were not, these were ideologically motivated peoples, and they were ideologically motivated by the discoveries of Sir Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton was the last alchemist that was formally recognized as such, and he was one of the first of scientists. So you've got a man who bridges the gap between what is considered magic and what is considered science, which are simply two different philosophies or two different paradigms or interpretations of reality and ways to work with reality. And he used both science and magic in his experiments. Now, this resulted, just like the first emperor of China, Emperor Qin, was consulting with Taoists. Taoists were working with Chinese alchemy. And one of the things they worked with was mercury. Mercury was, of course, considered magical and perhaps even medicinal. And as a result of being treated by the Taoists towards the hopes of attaining longevity or immortality, the first emperor of China, Emperor Qin, suffered from mercury poisoning, which induced insanity and madness. That's what happened to Sir Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton became poisoned with the mercurial and various other chemicals he was working with as an alchemist, to the point where he had to be institutionalized. A number of times this was well hidden because he was, of course, a member of the noble class of Great Britain. And his friends would rally around him and bring him out of these periods of madness and insanity. And he, of course, would be let loose to rain terror on his society once again. He was one of the great promoters of debtors' prisons because as a nobleman, he could institutionalize policies like that. So we have an individual who basically created the model of the clockwork universe. We still use Newtonian mechanics today to reach the moon. We don't use Einsteinian physics. We use Newtonian mechanics. So what he stumbled onto, or rather created in his brilliance, what he was able to articulate, what he was able to fathom, is indispensable. Our reality is founded on it and only enriched and complexified by Albert Einstein, and whatever discoveries happen in the future will do the same with Einstein, as Einstein's work and discoveries or articulations did to Sir Isaac Newton. There's no such real revolutions like Copernican revolutions, except extraordinarily rarely in examples where you have a demonstrably dysfunctional model. So the Copernican scientific revolution, which is seen as, oh, that's how scientific development works or progress works, is based on this Copernican kind of change where the entire concept of the universe changes. Okay, that's extraordinarily rare, and that's not how science progresses. That was the elimination of a dysfunctional model and the replacement of it with a model that functions. Science truly works in the way that the Einsteinian transition from Newtonian mechanics worked, where you still use one set of rules for operational situations and the other set of rules for strategic situations, meaning cosmic situations. And so operational situations in Newtonian mechanics would be landing on the moon. Strategic situations where you're working with the cosmos itself, you turn towards Einsteinian physics. So these are both functional with each other, and they don't cancel each other out. But in terms of Sir Isaac Newton and what we learned from him, it was turned into a religion, or turned into a religious expression by men like Napoleon Bonaparte, the first emperor of a radicalized French republic, the first French regime, the First Republic, was far more murderous than Vichy was during the time of the Third Reich. It was a period of time in which a war of genocide was waged against those who cleaved towards the belief in the Catholic Church, towards those who stood by the nobility. The Vendée region of France was loyalist, and they suffered a genocidal annihilation at the hands of the Revolutionary Republic. This is the kind of madness that we were dealing with the radicalized French Republic, which was inspired by the American Revolution. And the American Revolution was a conservative insurgency. What you had was men who were conservative in the sense they had something to conserve. These were slave-owning, land-owning, property-owning, plantation holders, and they were pure, raw evil in every sense of the word. There was no redeeming feature to the Founding Fathers. Nothing good could ever come from them. Just need to get that out of the way so people understand these were not godly men. These were deists who, like Napoleon Bonaparte, who wanted to build monumental architectural temples honoring Sir Isaac Newton. So too, the Founding Fathers took that towards deifying themselves. So I'm going to let you enter at this point to kind of add some context to this as well.
It's funny because I just got back from the Ozarks, and when I came back, I saw this guy that had these blankets on the side of the road. One was a big Confederate flag blanket. One had a giant bear on it with a rifle and bullets, and it said, "My right to bear arms." And I said, you know what? That's my last name. I gotta pull over and pick this up. So anyway, I pulled over. I talked to the guy for a minute, and he said, you know what? He started just going off about the Civil War. And I said, do you mind if I record this? I have a broadcasting channel. He said, sure, go right ahead. So essentially, I pulled out my Sony Action Cam. I started recording him. He said, well, there was a 12-hour documentary talking about the Civil War. He said, none of that was fought based upon race. It was fought based upon taxes. And Abraham Lincoln, he had a man lover in the White House, and he was a devil worshiper. They told us all about this on a 12-hour documentary, and this is on the National Archives. And I said, are you sure it wasn't the National Enquirer? And he said, no, it was the National Archives. And I got this on video. I just haven't released it yet. I did release the minute-and-a-half clip that he talked about Trump and how he thinks Trump's going to be, good for the nation. But yeah, it's very interesting. So what's your take on that?
Oh, God.
Hello.
Yeah, that's in terms of something that it needs to be emphasized, of course. Abraham Lincoln obviously was a madman. He obviously was a tyrant.
Did he fight vampires? And did he...
We've gone into Abraham Lincoln before and his suspension of habeas corpus and the fact that he arrested and detained people who were believed to be potentially sympathetic to Southern secession or independence. And all of these people were in jail till the day he died. If he had lived another 100 years, they would have been in jail till the day he died a century later. When he was basically warned by many of his own staff that this was entirely unconstitutional, of course, they were also placed in prison. Now, when it comes to the worship of certain entities, Abraham Lincoln was indeed involved with what many American fundamentalists would consider to be satanic, which would be activities such as basically various forms of divination, various forms of, shall we say, seance and whatnot. But I don't think he needs to be taken to the level of, quote unquote, the devil himself, because we're talking about somebody who was evil for different reasons. He was an American Stalin, but as we'll get into soon enough, he could never really compare to Joseph Stalin in the sense that he would have had he lived. Now, when it comes to diabolic entities, you could say that he had his own devils to fight in that he would be the modern clinical textbook case of morbid depression. That is something that psychiatrists actually refer to Abraham Lincoln as a condition. They've done so in the past. He is one of the role models for diagnoses of morbid depression. Morbid depression, of course, in this day and age would be considered an insanity. It's a pathology to the point where it does need to be treated with heavy drugs on the basis of conventional medical interpretation, just to qualify that. So when we're dealing with Abraham Lincoln, it would be said via modern psychiatric definition that you had a madman in the White House. That would be incontrovertible by modern paradigmatic matrix. We'll leave it at that for now, because when it comes to his sexual proclivities, he may or may not have been gay. He certainly did not care for his wife. She was left abandoned on his death. His children tried to have his wife, their own mother, institutionalized, and she had to escape to Europe. to escape institutionalization by her own children. So nobody references that. Nobody goes back to that reality. The Lincoln dynasty was not a happy one. It was not filled with people who were good. It was a royal mess. And but I wouldn't say satanic, but then it didn't need to be. Had he not been assassinated by a Confederate soldier, had a Confederate soldier not blown his brains out, he would have deported the entire population of African Americans. He had started to do this. This is inarguable. This is incontestable. Not only did he plan on deporting the entire African American population, he planned on deporting any Caucasian woman who were accused of having sex with blacks, including prostitutes who professionally served blacks in brothels, were all to be deported back to Africa. And this was how the nation of Liberia got started. Now, the British have an equivalent to this. It's called Sierra Leone. If you take a look at the map of Africa, there are two tiny little statelets that are on just the tip of the coast of Africa that's furthest pointing towards the west, hanging out there in the Atlantic. And they're very close to the old Gold Coast, Skeleton Coast, and Ivory Coast and Slave Coast areas where slaves were, of course, taken from, hence the names like Gold Coast. Gold was stolen from the native peoples. Ivory Coast, ivory was brought in from elephants that they slaughtered. The Skeleton Coast, because of all the bodies that were created from the natives that they massacred. The Slave Coast, because of all the slaves they brought across the Atlantic. Now, right to the northwest of these tragic areas, named after atrocity, we have the nations of Sierra Leone and Liberia, and they're both English speaking. And if you go into Sierra Leone, they all speak what is called the King's English. They all speak British English. And if you go into Liberia, they all speak what's called the President's English, which is they speak American English. And what happened was that Lincoln established Liberia on the basis of the model of Sierra Leone, where when the British got all moralistic and rehabilitated themselves to their credit, they ended the institution of slavery. But of course, they didn't want all those blacks living in England, so they dumped them back in Africa. And the place where they dumped them on the coast became the nation of Sierra Leone. In America's case, Lincoln was dumping them all in Liberia, which was going to become enormous because he was going to take all of the blacks in the United States and send them back to Liberia. By the way, millions of them would have died en route, just as millions of them died in the transatlantic slave trade, which brought them to the United States. So Lincoln was going to send them all back to Africa, and those that made it there before he had his brains blown out. And slavery, it was still legal in the United States. He made it illegal in quote unquote the rebel states in the Confederate States of America, but he kept it legal in the United States. It was legal till the day he died. If he had lived to be 100, it would have been legal till the age he was 100 in the United States. Slavery was okay for the Union. He just didn't want the Confederates to have slaves because that meant manpower at their disposal. So you're talking about a profoundly evil son of a bitch, a human piece of shit. And of course, the question does come up with people who are, in a sense, apologists for slavery. Were the slaves happy? Okay, that's a ridiculous question because that brings us back to the Founding Fathers. Slaves are, that's a moot point because the slaves are not considered human beings. It's like saying, are your animals happy? By law, by definition, when you have slaves as an institution, chattel slavery, the slaves are by definition not human. They're ambulatory property. That means they're like a tractor. That means they're like a cow. So when it's not a question of whether your tractor is happy, it's a question of whether it's functioning. It's not a question of whether your cow is happy, other than the fact that is it not sick? I mean, recently we have campaigns against animal cruelty. People campaign for merciful slaughter of animals. It would be along those lines that they would treat slaves as something that would be like chattel. So in that sense, of course, we're dealing with an institution people have a difficulty comprehending in this day and age. An institution, of course, which was obviated by the assassination of President Lincoln. And so that was one of the best things that happened in human history, was the assassination of the President Lincoln. If that did not happen, there would be no blacks in the United States today, which would make Trump happy, but very few other people would be happy about that, particularly blacks who would otherwise be living in Liberia, which is a hellhole. And by the way, yes.
Why was he taken out, though? I mean, was there a specific reason or was there a multitude of reasons?
Oh, like with every assassination, there is a multitude of reasons as to why it takes place. And in his case, one of the primary reasons was, of course, the fact that he was going to deport a major labor force for the United States. What happened was when, with his death, slavery was outlawed ultimately after a period of time, many, many decades in the United States. But what was instituted was worse than slavery, because with slavery, when the blacks were considered property, then they would be maintained in the same manner you would maintain a flock of sheep or a herd of cows or a fleet of tractors by their owners, in the sense that you wouldn't have breakouts of smallpox. There would be various other things that would be provided in terms of maintenance. Now, none of this rationalizes slavery. None of this justifies slavery. My point is that as soon as they were freed, there was a smallpox plague. Many hundreds of thousands of them died of smallpox. The United States did nothing to intervene with that. And of course, what happened as well was that what the whites were allowed to do was they were allowed to institute gerrymandering, which was the rigging of district elections or reconfiguration of districts and their mapping for elections, so that the whites would continually win. So while it may be a matter of controversy as to whether the South won the Civil War, quote unquote, actually a war between nations, the Confederate States of America and the United States of America, both separate nations on the North American continent, whether it's debatable or not whether the Confederacy won the Civil War militarily, they most certainly won the peace. And by winning the peace, they were able to preserve far more of the antebellum, meaning pre-war culture, than the North did. By basically persecution, terrorization of the blacks, suppression of them by gerrymandering of districts so their votes would be discounted. And the end result was that Jim Crow laws were able to reign supreme. The Klan was able to terrorize, and basically blacks were cowed. They were kept down. They were repressed, suppressed for decades. And when we think about this, how it came down, one of the things that comes to mind is vagrancy laws. The whites instituted vagrancy laws, which meant that a black man had to prove that he was employed whenever he was caught loitering, which meant that he was just anywhere to be seen. So he could be approached by white men who could make a citizen's arrest. He could be approached by any lawman, any law enforcement agent, what we would call peace officers today. And at that time, they would ask him for papers to prove that he was employed. Now, no black man could produce those because nobody hired black men. So since the black men were not hired, they were all vagrants. And because of that, they would be arrested at will by the police and then basically auctioned off, for all intents and purposes, on an auctioning block to northern corporations, who then employed them to mine coal for the North in southern mines, where they would die thousands of feet underground, choking to death, their lungs black with coal, dying of asbestos and everything else, dying of suffocation, cave-ins, everything you can imagine. And their bodies would be taken out on carts by the dozens, and basically new blacks brought in that had been arrested for vagrancy. This was worse than slavery. So that is what became the norm until World War II, when, of course, the majority of these blacks had criminal records. That's where the term 4F comes from. 4F means you fail physically, mentally, educationally. You have a criminal record. All these 4F blacks, how did they come into being? Are they all lazy, uneducable louts who are just somehow borderline retarded criminals? No, because they were all arrested on vagrancy laws. They all had criminal records. So what did the United States do? They put them into engineering battalions and had them build the Lado Road, the Burma Road leading up into China, all the way directly into the capital of Chongqing, the wartime capital of the Nationalist Republic of China, my nation. They built a slave-built road leading up to the capital of my nation when it was established on the mainland. And hundreds of these blacks died. They were forced to build shacks for their officers who were all white from the Deep South, who used whips against them. They were forced to build shacks for them on stilts so the officers could sleep without all of the termites and the centipedes and the rats biting them, where the blacks had to sleep on the ground, be eaten alive literally by tigers in the night. Now, this is the condition blacks were working in World War II. And what do they show you? They show you films like Red Tails. They show you films that are full of shit about, oh, we had some blacks fighting up there in planes. Yeah, That for every black you had in a plane, you had 10,000 on the ground dying overseas in China, Burma, India theater being whipped by a white officer. That's how ignorant you effing Americans are. And what do you say you fought World War II for? Freedom! Say it again, man. Freedom! You're so full of shit, you make me sick. I want to vomit just being here. But I'm stranded here so I can expose this reality to you because you lost the war. They're free. That was due to the Axis. My side, not yours. Because if you had won the goddamn war, they'd all still be in slave battalions today.
What about Iceland or, I don't know, Australia or New Zealand?
At any rate, I mean, when you bring that up, is that as a joke? I mean,
no, I mean, no, I'm genuine, because if America is as bad as you're bringing it up to be, I mean, because Iceland, I've heard they got rid of the bankers, they've got free press, they've got the opportunity out there to speak their minds.
You mean alternative places to settle?
I was totally serious about that.
Yeah, you mean alternative places for, say, an earnest American to settle?
Anybody, just a human being that wants to have an opportunity to speak their mind and not be under some corporate spell.
Well, let's get serious about this. In terms of Australia, Australia is like a giant sheep ranch full of human sheep who are just ranched in and corralled by the Americans.
Iceland.
Yeah. Australia's got more United States military bases on it than it's got Australian military bases. Just so you know, Australia's an occupied nation.
I've heard that about Australia. Wasn't Australia founded on? I mean, didn't they put a lot of the, I guess, what was considered vagabond or like even prisoners and refugees?
Australia was just built on a bunch of people who were exiled based on petty criminality or whatever charges were levied against them by the British government. The majority of Australians are of Irish descent, and what they were doing was depopulating Ireland by shipping all the Irish over to Australia. So Australia is based on criminals, again, in the African-American experience sense of the term, criminals who are not necessarily criminals. They're criminalized. It's a criminalized population on the basis of law as imposed by a tyrannical government. And yes, the Irish have been treated like shit for centuries. And of course, this was part of a campaign of slavery. The Irish people were white slaves. Many of them were enslaved as well in the Confederate States of America, or up until the period of time around the time that the Confederate States of America was established. There were white slaves throughout all of North America, and many of them were Irish, many of them were German, many of them were French Huguenots or French Protestants that had lost the 30 Years' War against the church in the European continent. I mean, I could go on and on. In Iceland, of course, I would hate to see people flooding Iceland because Iceland is one of the last pure white, shall we say, gene pools on the face of the earth. There is indeed a danger of the white race being bred off the face of the earth. I would not want to see that.
And there's a reason for that, isn't there?
Well, the reason is, stupidity of the whites. Yeah. I mean,
well, there's more to it. Isn't there like a metaphysical reason to it, Douglas?
Well, we'll get into that. We'll get into that. That's an assault on the roots of Adam man. We'll get into that now. So let's finish up with the founding fathers. Why people have to dissociate Christian identity from national identity in the United States. When I bring up the founding fathers and what scumbags they were, I've talked before about people like Thomas Jefferson, who was committing the moral version of incest and or bestiality by screwing all of his slaves, literally having sex with them, producing half yellow kids by them, and doing this generationally. The kids he produced, he would have sex with, and he would have them different gradations of colors to the point where they were 1/8 black, where they would be called octoroon. Now, he didn't live long enough to get to that point. That's 8 generations down the road. But he was working his best towards that. And he was doing this out of supposedly scientific reasons. And you had somebody like that on your $20 bill. Now, none of these people could say no. So this is the equivalent of having sex with a child or an animal, since they're having sex with somebody who's legally their property. And everybody thought he was a great guy who was a fellow founding father. And you've got guys like Benjamin Franklin, who was essentially a serial killer, and somebody who I've brought up before as basically butchering blacks, slaves, and, of course, tearing their bodies apart and sewing them back up together again, trying to reanimate them with electricity. Now, of course, they'll talk about all of the black bones and bodies found in the home of his gay lover in England, saying, oh, well, his gay lover was an anatomist, and they had to have all these black bones around because, he had to work on bodies, so he just took a bunch of blacks and worked on the bodies. So it's cool. But they had bodies like that here in the United States as well, but they had covered that up. And the reality was he was the inspiration for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's doctor. Then you got George Washington, and George Washington was known as the village burner in the Mohawk language because of all the villages he ordered razed. The villages would be surrounded by his men while all of the braves, the male warriors, were out hunting on expedition, and then they'd set them on fire. Then all the women, children, the infants, the seniors, the elderly would come running out, and they would be shot and stabbed. Elders, children, women with infants in their arms, all alike. In one campaign alone, hundreds of thousands died from New York, across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, into Ohio. And yet this son of a bitch has got his face on your $1 bill, and his name curses your capital, just like Ben Franklin is on your century, your $100 bill. I mean, there's nothing good that could come from a group of criminals and madmen like this. And this is what brings us back to the comparison with Asiatic culture. There's no word in the Japanese language for privacy. Any term they have for it is what's called a borrowed term that comes from the West that is Japanized using a kind of romaji that uses very simplistic characters to make a Japanese phoneticization or sounding of some word that would sound like privacy. There's no word in Chinese, the language of Putong Wakoye, the national language of Mandarin Chinese, or any of the dialects, for independence. The closest concept we have to a concept of independence in the Chinese culture is a literally criminal mindset. The character, the iconograph that would reference that would transliterate into English as something similar to F everybody, every man for himself. So when the Declaration of Independence is transliterated, literally translated into the Chinese, it is a criminal contract between a bunch of criminals who got together and said, well, we all agree, F everybody, every man for himself. Now, I think that's the most accurate translation we can have of the Declaration of Independence. And the reason that Americans don't deserve independence is because they don't have the adult responsibility with which to act independently. They act irresponsibly. They act irresponsibly as individuals, and they act irresponsibly as a nation. So that is where we come back to Christianity. What is the closest thing that can help discipline Americans, bring them into some sense of a moral compass? Christianity. So don't conflate your Christianity with the Founding Fathers or some misguided sense of patriotism, because the Founding Fathers were not godly men. These were not Christians. These were men who denied the existence of God. As deists, they felt that God had created a Newtonian clockwork universe, had abandoned it. We lived in the house of a God gone away, and that great men like these deistic Freemasons could assume the throne of God himself. And that's why George Washington was deified in a cult that fell flat on its face. We don't all bow towards Washington, D.C. as Americans the way Muslims bow towards Mecca 3 times a day. But that is what the Founding Fathers wanted. And in a sense, that's what we have now through constitutional fundamentalists like militia movements, militia patriots. What is this? It's a form of constitutional fundamentalism. And if you were truly a constitutional fundamentalist, let's get back to the bare bones of the Constitution. You'd get rid of all of the appendices. You'd get rid of basically all of the addendums. You'd get rid of everything that altered the Constitution to make life bearable today. You would basically reinstitute slavery. Women would be deprived of the right to vote. We would go back in time. This is the reactionary movement which led to the election of Donald Trump through the Electoral College. And he may still not be president. There's still counting to be done through the Electoral College. So he may not become president. And that was done today on the 19th. But none of the votes are really due until whenever the Electoral College is. They feel like turning them in. It's like the College of Cardinals that elects the Pope. So there's no penalty for the electoral collegiates for turning in late votes. We will not know who is our president until literally somebody steps in the Oval Office on the 20th of January. That's how odd the situation truly is in the United States. Well, the one thing Americans have to do is, first off, identify yourself as an American far more than as a citizen of the United States. Just as there were Russians long before there was a constitutional republic known as the Soviet Union. And there are still Russians that have survived the collapse of the Soviet Union. So too, there were Americans hundreds of years before, and these were European Americans hundreds of years before there was a constitutional republic known as the United States, which was established by a bunch of traitors to the crown. And so too, with the collapse of that constitutional republic, there are going to be Americans here, many of them European Americans, many of them African Americans. And we're all going to have to learn to live in North America and not necessarily together. At that point, you either have a decision for rehabilitating a reconstituted United States or balkanizing into a black America, a white America, and further balkanizing into Irish America, Italian America, quite seriously. And these would be nations that would be functional based on homogenous cultures or cultures that tended towards more homogeneity. Now, someone like myself, who's, of course, a cosmogenate, which would be the correct term for what used to be termed a miscegenate, which implied a downbreeding. But as a cosmogenate, it means that somebody's of a mixed race heritage without insulting them or inferring inferiority. As a cosmogenate, people like me would thrive in cosmopolitan free cities. You don't have mixed race people for the most part living outside of major cosmopolitan regions. Now, of course, you used to have slaves in the Deep South, and you probably see octoroons in the Ozarks, where you were up in. For reasons that I still have yet to fathom. I assume that you were trying to recover the Necronomicon or something from some morbidly inbred affiliates or something like that. But aside from all of that, your business
actually, I did uncover the Necronomicon, but according to Marvel and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., you have to be an android to be able to read the Necronomicon, or else you're going to lose your mind and you're going to kill yourself. So I did have an android read it for me, but yes, I did pick it up in the Ozarks. And wait a second. I gotta interject here because yes, I've heard the saying before, them hills have eyes. The people that I met in the Ozarks were extremely friendly, and Jeff, the guy that's actually putting together this survival community, for what it's worth, and you can call this a shameless plug, that's all right. Those guys are putting together tiny homes for like a couple $1,000s. And if you go to travelchannel.com, you can have the same tiny home built for $55,000 on wheels. Or if you're looking for an option to kind of get off the grid, and if you want to be in an area that doesn't have a Walmart, let's say a McDonald's, a Burger King, a Kmart, if you want to be in a place off the grid, I think that it's a pretty cool area. Now, there's nice people out there, Douglas.
Right. Oh, by the way, I would like to personally apologize to the people of the Ozarks. One of the things that always offends me about the American culture is the sense of superiority that many city people have, that many urbane people have, the sense of sophistication that we get out of people like Johnny Carson. When Johnny Carson was on TV every night, he was coming out in New York City, which, of course, is considered by New Yorkers to be the epitome of sophistication. And what a lot of this is just jaded, faded degeneracy more than it is sophistication. Sophistication comes from the term sophist, which is a philosophy, sophistry. And sophistry, of course, was a kind of mercenary philosophy. It was a philosophy that was extraordinarily pragmatic. It doesn't come from the goddess Sophia necessarily, though Sophia is the goddess of wisdom. And Sophia, as it's correctly pronounced in the original Atlantic, it can be taken into sophist and sophistication as people who are purveying a kind of wisdom. So we can speak of that later, but it has no real impact immediately on what we're discussing tonight. But my point is that what you don't have with many of these attitudes is a respect for indigenous cultures. Now, at this point in history, when we speak of people in the Ozarks and the Appalachian Mountains, that's about as close to an indigenous white culture as you're going to get in North America, outside of my tribe of Native Americans, of which I am 1/8 descended from, the Mandan, because the Mandan are historically assumed to be a long-lost Welsh colony. And as a long-lost Welsh colony, which is interbred with the Indians, they became a white tribe in North America. So in terms of what is ongoing with the people of the Ozarks and the Appalachians, they are pretty much at this point part of the land. They don't identify cannot identify for the most part, other than extraordinary communities that do seem to identify with certain biblical lineages, literally. At times, they make that claim, which may not be in any way, shape, or form false. They seem to have some very unique genetics in that area. But many of them, of course, are just so interbred in terms of European bloodlines that they are, for all intents and purposes, something new, a new race that has come to pass on the North American continent. Whereas in many other places of America, they are still very culturally oriented, Italian, American, Irish American, etc. So in terms of these Americans, they are a great example of what I am talking about in terms of an American identity superseding that of a United States identity. The Constitutional Republic of the United States could collapse tomorrow, and these people that you were interacting with will go on existing the way they existed for hundreds of years. They will feel no impact of any note. And what impact they felt would be overcome within a matter of a generation or two. And they're the inspiration for books like the Foxfire series. Foxfire was a series of books about Appalachian and Ozark wisdom and ad hocery for how to survive using basically what we would call hillcracker technology, how to get water out of a well, how to basically make a fire using a tin, et cetera, et cetera. You get my point. But in terms of one of the things I noted was in order to communicate with each other, of course, living very far away from each other, separated by miles, they were certainly not within sight of each other. But that's where we developed the yaller, or the kind of yodel that is native to North America, an indigenous kind of yodeling. And so this form of predominantly southern area culture was what led to the concept of the rebel yell, or the practice of the rebel yell during the war between the American nations. Now, somebody like Johnny Carson would bring on people who would do bird calls, and the audience would laugh at them. Literally laugh at them, because to them this was so stupid that somebody would do this, whereas something like that would be necessary for survival of somebody who grew up hunting pheasant or various other kinds of birds, or hiding themselves from people who were hunting them by emulating birds for communications with each other while avoiding discovery by their human hunters. Now, this is what made the Southerners such fabulous guerrilla warfare fighters. Now, of course, when I was in a cab one time with an American cab driver in San Francisco, and there was a program on in which they were basically having these kinds of calls that these indigenous Americans, for all intents and purposes, they're indigenous at this point, white, of course, but indigenous, they would call out to each other to identify whether one was alive in the morning. I mean, basically, they would get up in the morning. You're entirely dependent on your neighbor for security. You're entirely dependent on your neighbor for communications. If your neighbor dies, this is a major change in your life. This is a life-changing factor. So they would yodel to each other so that they would basically be able to identify if their neighbor was alive or not. Their neighbor would respond. So when this was being demonstrated over the radio at one point, and this cab driver turned it off, I said, oh, well, I found that interesting to listen to. And he looked at me with complete and utter contempt and said, you're a piece of shit, because I even demonstrated a cultural interest in how a specific regional culture survived. And this is how Americans are. The Americans hate humanity. They hate anybody who's capable of expressing a culture, because Americans have no culture. They're an anti-culture. So Americans that they hate the most are often Southern Americans, because Southern Americans have a culture. Now, you yourself, when you were speaking of the people in the Ozarks and the guy you saw with the blankets, and you affected an accent that is almost irresistible to do when we discuss these cultures. It's very easy to fall prey to that, just as I fell prey to, of course, talking about morbidly inbred relations, fighting over, clans fighting over a copy of the Necronomicon. But in terms of this, we really do need to check ourselves. But that brings us back to, of course, Christianity and the misunderstanding of where Christianity is going in the world as we enter the third millennium of Christianity, the third millennium of the Christian calendar in the 21st century. Now, most Americans are under the impression that Christianity is diminishing in the world with the loss of quote unquote Christian principles in the United States. Things like prayer in school or the Ten Commandments being removed from courthouses, Christian crosses being removed from Washington, D.C., and all of this getting increasingly banished. What Americans get the impression of is that we're increasingly agnostic and even atheistic or irreligious. Okay, the rest of the world is not like that. That is actually propaganda, which is promoted on the taxpaying American electorate by the Department of Defense, the Luciferan military junta, which of course takes its diabolism straight from the founding fathers, the de-Masons, the people who believe themselves deistic and capable of assuming the throne of God himself. And in terms of this, they've so isolated the Americans in a totalitarian media machine that Americans have no idea that Christianity is exploding in the rest of the world. I mean, basically, Americans are familiar with secular movements that are based on information sanitization. All they hear about are movements like libertarianism, feminism, environmentalism. These are axiomatic to Americans. But in terms of Christianity and its explosion in the Africa, Asia, Latin America, that's entirely ignored by American media, so it's expurgated from American consciousness. But Christianity is very much on the rise. It is the majority religion in the rest of the world. It's in more traditionalist manifestations than have ever appeared in the United States in many decades. Basically, you have an awareness of Christianity in Africa and Pan America and even Asia that would be considered neo-medievalist. So they're entering a feudal phase of spiritual development. So by the year mid-20th century, by the year 2050, which is just literally only a few years from now, for all intents and purposes, in the blink of a historical eye, only one Christian in every five is going to be a non-Latino white person. The center of gravity of the Christian world is moving completely to the southern hemisphere, and in a few decades at the most, the original focal points of Christianity, the nodes of the faith, will no longer be Roma or Athens. It won't be Paris. It won't be London. It won't be New York. It's going to be places like Manila and Kinshasa and Addis Ababa in Ethiopia and Buenos Aires. Of course, what does this mean? It means that Christianity is going to be dominated by the culture matrices that are entirely alien to anything an American knows. Everything an American knows, particularly a Black American or a white American, is based on European history. What they know is based on the cultures of the Rhine, the cultures of the Volga, the cultures of course, London on Thames. These are the cultures of the Mekong. These are the cultures of the Indus Valley. These are the cultures of the Amazon. They are entirely, truly alien to anything you understand. And the Christianity that they've developed that's expanding so rapidly is reactionary, it's conservative, it's evangelical, it's apocalyptic, it's the tenets of faith comprise mysticism, Puritanism, belief in prophecy, faith healing, exorcism, dream visions. And these are, of course, have been abandoned in the United States and in the West, completely, in Europe as well, for progressive political and social concerns. So the impacts are going to be, of course, astronomical. They're going to be incalculable. We are entering a new dark age of religious warfare. Now, this is not necessarily a negative. We've been here before. The last dark ages, a man's religion was his politics. There was no such thing as politics. Man's religion was his politics. We'll go into that again in a bit when we go back into the Middle Ages and how Christianity came to be understood or misunderstood by the West. But in terms of identification, it's religiosity that will take precedence over allegiance under secular nation states. So as Christianity grows, so too does Islam. These are both religions projected to increase, but I can assure you Christianity is increasing at a far more rapid rate than Islam. So people who truly tell you that Islam is a threat in a military sense on this global level are Islamophobic. And the only way that that's happening is based on Western surrender. Not based on Islamic militancy, though that militancy is encouraged by Western surrender. So that is something that will bring us back to the religious wars where they will not surrender in the rest of the world. Places like Nigeria, the Philippines, the Islamic Republic of Indonesia will enter in a state of religious conflict. So these are the kind of this is the kind of future that we face. So we need to definitely get a grip on what these cultures are about. And so that's what I'll try and explain tonight to a degree. So it's definitely a world in which we all need to accommodate the fact that much of this religious threat of Islam is generated by the United States itself. Now, I got a question in the text box asking me about the Talmud, and I'll get into that to an extent, however, peripherally, when we're talking about the tribal identity of the Jewish God that many Americans conflate with their Christian God, and it's not the same. Now, much of what we're facing today is a lot of threat ongoing from an organization that's called ISIS. And so I'll go into that after I turn towards Rex Bear to go a bit into what we've already covered. So Rex, take it over.
Yeah, fantastic. And one of the things that I was wondering about is there's so many different religious texts that give somebody of a specific belief system an opportunity to think they're better than somebody else, such as if you read the Talmud, what it says you can do if you're of a specific faith or a specific lineage. If you read many of the texts, even Christian religion or the Muslim faith, it seems like there's all this division. Even if you get into the New Testament, when Jesus says, I'm here to create division, I'm not here to bring peace, you're going to see father against son, mother against daughter, essentially is what he says. So it's like people think, oh, Jesus is bringing peace, but no, if anything, Jesus even says he's bringing the sword. He's bringing war. So what's that all about? Is that legit? I mean, if you look at the Old Testament, when you see how God tells somebody to go kill every man, woman, child, and all the livestock because they're of specific lineage, if God is all-knowing, then why would he create something to cause such pain and suffering towards each other?
We'll get into that, and we need to contextualize that first. And what Jesus is speaking of, I bring you not peace but a sword. I come here to turn son against father, father against son. He's bringing a faith that is going to change the world, and that faith is not going to meet without resistance. So in terms of what he's bringing, we're definitely talking about a new message which will not be tolerated by those who have a vested interest in that religiosity not being, shall we say, spread, disseminated, followed. And the end result, of course, would be the deaths of many people, because he himself was almost killed as a child by people who tried to prevent him from coming into the world. He knew he would be killed, of course, going out of the world in a very violent fashion, and that people who followed him would have to defend themselves. Just because you're Christian does not mean that you do not have a right to defend yourself. And here is where I, of course, stand with Americans. Of course, I have my own firearms, and I'm very much shall we say, I very much approve of the right to bear arms. of course, but then take a look at the environment I live in. I live in the United States, and of course, I need my firearms to protect myself against you, not Rex Bear, but the majority of Americans out there, who are just truly violent and often insane. So I get
You're
death
awesome,
threats on
man.
a daily basis. Well, thank you. I get death threats on a daily basis. I get bomb threats. I get rape threats, and then it goes downhill from there.
Do you really?
Oh yeah, I've gotten that for years and years, ever since I exposed what I did at the Presidio military base in terms of the child molestation scandal. We'll get into that some other day.
Sure.
Again, but in terms of when we're speaking about what we see today, for instance, is ISIS. ISIS is on the loose in the Middle East and what is correctly termed Southwest Asia. And ISIS, of course, is a product of the United States. It's an American corporation. When Senator of Arizona, senior senator at that, John McCain, says that he has regular communications with the ISIS organization, it's because he's a stockholder. The shares are sold and traded, bought and sold on the New York Stock Exchange for ISIS, and it's an American corporation. So its acronym is for Integrated Systems Improvement Services. And it, of course, is trademarked, and it's headquartered outside Fort Huachuca in the state of Arizona, where, of course, John McCain is a senior senator. And their Washington District of Columbia office is located in the Ronald Reagan building. So they're supposedly dedicated to supporting national defense. One of the things that they've done forever is provide contract security to Geico, with the little effing lizard and the caveman. And Geico is an acronym. Geico stands for Government Insurance Company. That's why Geico Insurance takes pride with the little stupid phallic lizard going around on aircraft carriers and shit, being flown over in military helicopters to the front, talking to sailors and soldiers and airmen and shit, is because Geico insures, of course, military servicemen, because it's a government insurance company. So that, of course, is provided security when Geico agents go down to Mexico by, of course, government contractors, in this case, by ISIS. And of course, they've got an empty building that was awarded to them by the Department of Defense in Minden, Nevada. And that's where their think tank is. Their think tank is ISIS in Minden, Nevada, and that's an acronym for Integrated Strategic Intelligence Services. And so, yes, I saw in the text box somebody says that, of course, when we're talking about Geico, we're talking about reptilian shapeshifters. Well, I'll go for that. I mean, of course, I don't literally believe that, and I don't want you to either, but, we're dealing with some very shifty people. Of that, there is no doubt. But ISIS Federale, on their own website, which they've changed to SIS, S-I-S. They've taken the I out of it, but you'll still see ISIS all over their website. You'll still see on their headquarters building that acronym. They do say that they are an extension of the government. And so as an extension of the government, they are a private army that prevents what you would call liability. They are a plausible deniability factor. And what they're used in is basically role playing. They hire or front themselves as Muslim extremists. So what their ISIS is comprised of are various criminals from the Arab world who are nominally Muslim, but essentially people who would otherwise be in jail anywhere in Dar al-Islam or the land of submission, that are bailed out of prison and given guns and cut loose to kill anybody they want. That is ISIS. That is what the United States government is contracting, and has been doing so for years. On the positive side of Trump, he is apparently going to end this, or claims that he's going to end his confrontation with Russia and Vladimir Putin, which means that he would stop financing ISIS, that ISIS would lose its contract to terrorize in Syria. And Syria is being terrorized for a very specific reason, because of its biblical origins of what I speak. The original language in which the revelation of the Magi, this particular apocryphon, was worded, was in the language of Syriac, which is, of course, a related dialect to Aramaic, which was the language that Jesus Christ himself spoke. And I'm going to let Rex jump in, because he's going to bring some context to this about other terrorist attacks that might be taking place in Europe as well.
Yeah, back a few years ago, Douglas, Assad was shown in images that he was dead and it seemed to be a big psyop campaign, but then there was nothing about it for several years after that. And I'm referring to the president of Syria, and I haven't seen any images of him that are newer over the past 3 years. So I'm thinking to myself, either he was taken out or they used that as a subliminal campaign to make people think he was taken out, but then no, he's back again. No, he isn't back. So is he still alive even? Because Damascus is in ruins. I mean, if you look at I saw some footage, some drone footage, by the way, of that area that was taken over a year ago, and it was toast, man. I mean, the buildings, it looked like Walking Dead all over again, but there was nobody there. There was no zombies or people. It was toast.
Yeah. Well, we can only speculate. That's the problem, is that neither you or I are on the ground. And we can thank God for that. But in terms
Absolutely.
of what is going on the ground is, of course, as you said, as close to chaos as you can get. It was, of course, engineered by ISIS and the American insurgency, which is an artificial Muslim insurgency. And yes, they did strike in Paris. They struck in Paris because there were enormous protests that were scheduled, similar to the Occupy movement in the United States, against the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement that were going to take place in Paris. And to make certain that the French stuck with the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, those strikes were conducted so that all protests had to be shut down before they even began. It was a preemptive strike. Now, you might say, what are the French doing in the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement? The French have an enormous amount of territories in the Pacific. This is where they conduct their nuclear tests, just like the Brits conduct their nuclear testing in Australia. And the French do so also in the Pacific Islands and their colonial territories. New Caledonia is an actual département of France. That means that it's the equivalent to Hawaii being a state of the United States. Obviously, there's some controversy of that from native New Caledonians, but just as there's controversy about Hawaii being a state of the United States by native Hawaiians.
Right.
But nevertheless, administratively, that's as much a part of France, according to European France, as Americans consider Hawaii to be a part of the United States, albeit that occurred well after the Second World War. As I pointed out multiple times in the past. The Japanese did not attack, of course, the United States. They attacked an American-occupied nation. Hawaii was, of course, an independent kingdom. Its Queen Regent was overthrown, Liliuokalani. She was placed under house arrest, where she was surrounded by United States Marines till the day she died. She appealed for help from Ayukaya, who was her bookkeeper, and he was a man who was the governor of Oahu during the Oahu sugar strikes, and he was able to relay her pleas for help to the Emperor of Japan. So the Japanese responded to Aboriginal Hawaiians' legal government crying for help and liberation from the occupation by the evil empire of the United States. End of story. No ifs, no ands, no buts, no excuses. So the Americans have no right in that fight that is on the side of right. And that's something that constantly they need to be reminded of. You are not on the right side of history. You are not on the right side of history. Stop thinking of yourself as a U.S. citizen, as a upholder of the evil American empire. Pay your taxes, of course. Do not disobey the law. Do not raise your arms in violent revolution or conflict. But for God's sake, understand that once the system collapses, as it inevitably will, your identity is not with the reconstitution of this wretched republic. It is with the building of new nations on the North American continent, the majority of which will likely be ethno-religiously identified by race and religion, as they are in the rest of the world, as opposed to a artificial constitutional or republican entity. Now, if you
is America, is America like basically a new Rome?
Well, America's situation is very similar to the Roman Empire without, in any sense, resorting to cliches. It's a hackneyed cliche, but it is nevertheless an accurate one. Most Americans don't understand this. Americans view themselves. This is why their military junta has maintained such a degree of control. They view themselves as an empire that is somehow different from Rome. Now, you're going to ask how. Basically, Rome was a universal empire, was it not? It was something that stretched across multiple cultures cultures, and it was across multiple cultural domains and worlds across the Mediterranean. It united the Mediterranean, the world of its time, because the Mediterranean straddles Europe, Asia, and Africa. So it was the Eurasia-African Empire. It was truly a global empire in that sense, a first one world empire. So we have an example that's a precedent. And I brought up multiple examples in the past in how America's precedent. In the military sense, Rome was incapable of surviving a head-to-head conflict. The one head-to-head conflict they had, they almost lost. They almost totally destroyed them. And that was the conflict with Carthage, which was a rival Mediterranean empire in North Africa. And the rival Mediterranean empire in North Africa, that of Hannibal's Carthage, almost destroyed Rome. Rome never had the stomach for a head-to-head conflict again. After that, every single conflict Rome engaged in was a conflict it knew it could win. It would only make sure bets. The one man
that sounds familiar.
Yeah, the one man who was going to take it in a different direction was Julius Caesar, and the correct Latin pronunciation for Caesar, as it's Anglo-bastardized, is Kaiser. That's where we get the term Kaiser from in the German emperorship. That's where we get the term Tsar from in the Russian. And Julius Caesar was going to take the fight once more head-to-head with Iran. He was going to attack Persia, what was then known as the Parthian Empire. And in terms of attacking the Parthian Empire, going towards a head-to-head conflict, I am confident he would have won. And Rome would still be around today. There would still be a Roman Empire today because they would have gotten gunpowder. Because if he had taken on Iran, they would have controlled the Silk Road, which means they would have gotten gunpowder out of China. And that means they would have had firearms. And they would still be around today. They would have been around 1,000 years. But his people didn't want that. And many of the people who were afraid to go head-to-head under the brilliant leadership of Julius Caesar assassinated him. And as a result, Rome ultimately died. The one man who could have made it last forever was killed. Of course, after that, he attained apotheosis. He was worshipped as a god, particularly in the Asian provinces of Rome. But by then it was too late. And so, too, America lost its head-to-head confrontation with Germany and Japan, the Axis. That almost destroyed the United States. Emperor Hirohito would have unleashed his biological weapons had the Americans not sued for peace. And, of course, the Americans found themselves afterwards in the same position as Rome. They could only take on wars they knew they would win. That is why they only fight third world banana republics or various nations that are incapable of fighting back. And so they, of course, under Donald Trump, perhaps he'll be the Julius Caesar of his time and try to take us into a head-to-head conflict with China, at which point, of course, more than likely he would be assassinated, as Julius Caesar was prior to his ability to do that by his own men, by his own military junta. Certainly nothing I would advocate, I assure you.
Let me jump in real quick, Douglas, if I can, about because I interviewed somebody recently that talked about the star charts of Donald Trump and the Vedic star charts, not the Western star charts, but the real detailed Indian type. We're talking very detailed, 12 different houses essentially. And she's saying that his intentions are genuine and what he wants to do to this country has made her feel a lot more at ease. But she's nervous also at the same time because she thinks that something might happen to him. And there's a lot of other people that feel that way as well. So do you think that that's certainly a possibility?
We can't speculate on that without getting into legal issues.
Nanu. You have been assimilated by the Borg.
Yeah, it's a topic that's not even worth discussing, to tell you the truth. Honestly, with something like that, there's nothing. There really is nothing to say. I mean, in all honesty, yeah, you don't know what's going to happen in that regard. At that point, we are tossing joysticks, as they would use in the Asian fortune-telling terminology. Now, in terms of, which brings us back to Asia. So let's get a bit into some of these historical matters that we were talking about, how Christianity and why does it have so much to do with Asia, particularly China and Japan. Now, the ancient name for the 7,000 Isles of Dainihon, or the Greater Japan, is Wakukugoya. Wakukugoya is actually a Chinese word because it was a Sinitic language interpretation of the Japanese nation. And the people of Japan at that time were not known as Nipponjin, or Japanese peoples. They were known as Wakokugoyans, which meant embodiments of inner peace. And we're talking about well over 1,000 years ago, something like 3,000 years ago. It's important to remember that when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in self-defense, when it conducted a strategic surgical strike to preempt a planned American bombing of Japan, which I've gone into in excruciating detail on multiple programs, and not necessarily with Rex Bear, but we might do that in the future. All people need to do is subscribe to Revolution Radio, and they can get the archives. And I would recommend, of course, the latest December 7th archive. In this case, I was interviewed by one of my fellow Revolution Radio hosts, in this case a hostess, Mona Radler, on her program Adventures of a Feral Hippie. So if you subscribe to Revolution Radio to access its archives, it's less than $5 a month, $4.95 a month to be precise. And you just go to the subscription page for archives at www.freedomslips.com. Subscribe at the bottom of the archives page, and you can access the December 7th transmission of Adventures of a Feral Hippie with Mona Radler interviewing Douglas Dietrich, and you can hear me speak to some extent on the preemptive surgical strike against Pearl Harbor. And then, of course, you can look up Douglas Dietrich Pearl Harbor and find my references and how I speak to it on Coast to Coast AM, any number of other areas. It's a great place to start. At any rate, when it comes to by the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, their Yamato dynasty was 2,600 years old. Now think about what I'm saying, 2,600 years old. It's the longest running dynasty on the face of the earth that is still extant and surviving. We're going back to the time of the pharaohs, and they are considered like the pharaocracy, which was god emperors. A pharaoh meant a god emperor. The Japanese imperial dynasty is one of deocracy, not deists like the American Freemasons, but deocracy. That means that they are ruled by divinity. That means they're ruled by a living god. So that was their interpretation. They considered their emperor to be half human, half divine, in the sense of Heracles or Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, of course, all Christians believe this. If you don't believe this, you're not Christian. Jesus Christ is considered half human, half divine, like Heracles, which is the correct pronunciation for Hercules, the original Hellenic Grecian actually being Iraklios. Now, in terms of the foundational cosmology of the Japanese people, it's collected in a volume known as the Kojiki, which is the record of ancient matters. And this was some 712 years prior to the birth of Christ that this volume was collected. And its hidden histories speak about the formation of the 7,000 islands of the Greater Japanese Empire and the foundation of human society. And one of the most important histories is that of the sun goddess, Amaterasu, more specifically, Amaterasu Umi Kami-sama. And this is, of course, the theomitochondrial ancestor of the Koshitsu, the imperial house of Japan. So the reason that this is important is because it is the foundation of the unbroken bloodline of monarchs that are believed to have emerged from the heavenly West, meaning from out of China to the of the Asian mainland to ascend to the Koi, or the chrysanthemum throne of the islands of Japan. and inseminating the unbroken lineage of the Mikado, the god emperors. This all appears, of course, okay, well, Douglas Dietrich is bringing up a culture that has no bearing on Christianity, but it absolutely does. And it's important to understand the meta-humanity, meaning superhumanity in the divine sense. Superhumanity would imply something like a superhero. Meta-humanity would imply somebody who's like a demigod. This perception of meta-humanity precedent Christ appeared in what Americans or Westerners consider the West in the form of Heraklios, which is bastardized as Hercules. And of course, we have an individual who became a great hero that was recorded in multiple secular volumes. Now, there is no questioning the fact that Jesus Christ was historical. He was a historical figure. We base this on historical evidence. There is enough historical evidence to confirm this, despite the arguments by atheists or agnostic scholars. He would not have persisted this long as one of the manifestations of a faith that had been founded thousands of years before himself, millions of years perhaps, had he not been historically real and the culmination of the prophecies of that faith. And so his historical existence is actually incontrovertible. And in the case of Hercules, there's even more secular evidence historically that he existed. There's at least 25 people that produced no less than 63 books which mention an historical Heracles that I know of. And these sources are all secular. So because there's enough evidence for a historical Jesus, we can only conclude that Hercules was undeniably the son of Zeus on earth. Now, that is something in which he kind of preceded Christ by traveling the land and helping mankind by performing miracles, just as Jesus would later do. He died. He rose to Mount Olympus to become a god, just as Jesus died and rose to heaven. And so we've got this precedent that people could consider to be a pagan Christ. But because of the number of references to him by everyone from Aesop of Aesop's Fables fame to Plato to Virgil, who of course prophesied the coming of Christ himself, we have enough evidence to show that these metahumans do walk the earth. And because of that, that is a validation of the imperial lineage of the cult of Japan, and it's also a validation of the other man gods who have walked the earth. Now, of course, Jesus was singular in the sense that he was the son of the God, the divinity, and beyond a tribal affiliation, beyond a national identity. But what was it that he produced as God? He produced a hypothetical, supposedly, sequence of lineal descendants from himself through Mary Magdalene. And this is what is known as the Merovingian bloodline. Now, this has, of course, been receiving a enormous amount of bad press through American films like The Matrix and popular culture. And, of course, people might ask, why would God want his son to be sacrificed? We'll get into that. Of course, that was necessary in order to show mankind the road to salvation through self-sacrifice, because God was willing to give his only son in the sense of showing us the route to salvation. So it's one of those things that will be outlined within context as we speak of this. But the important thing to remember about Mary Magdalene was that she was the first witness to the resurrection. She was the second most important woman in the New Testament after the Mother of God himself, the blessed Saint Theotokos, literally from the Greek, the bearer of God, Madonna, literally the Virgin Mother, the proper Italian honorific by which to address My Lady, the Mother of God, of course, being of Levantine, Southwest Asian ethnicity and Judaic faith. But of imperial Roman nationality. So in that sense, she was like an Italian citizen. So when we go from that point of the potential impregnation of Mary Magdalene, then, of course, she bore a natural child to the Christ, and basically her or some other woman or other woman aside from her or beside her, there may have been more, that are usually portrayed as Jesus's wife, Mary Magdalene, who are irreligial, a kind of religious profession, if you will, that I don't know if they're to be confused with the sacred prostitutes of that area of the world. But it is important to remember that Jesus Christ did hang out, so to speak, to use the common vernacular of today, with prostitutes and various other kinds of people that would be considered irredeemable by cultural norms. But whether it was Mary of Magdala's pregnancy or the pregnancy of others aside from herself, and there may have been more than one woman impregnated by Christ, it was their Germanized blood descendants in later centuries that founded the Merovingian dynasty of the Middle Ages and established through the early kings of the Frankreich the divine right of kingship through the holy bloodline of Jesus Christ. That was the rationalization for the divine right of kings. And so that was the rationalization for the establishment of the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire. Now, all of this is, of course, viewed as satanic by many of the Americans because they've been propagandized by the deistic founding fathers' heirs, the people who carry on their legacy in terms of the satanic military-industrial complex, the military junta, which runs your nation state. And so the military junta propagandizes against the Merovingian bloodline, and they propagandize against the bloodline of Jesus because they want you to deify George Washington and these deistic traitors to the crown who ultimately wanted you to worship them as God so they could take his place on the throne of the heavens itself. So that's the satanic empire which most Americans cleave to when they claim a patriotism to the constitutional republic of the United States. Now, what was going on in Japan, of course, was as a matter of fact, I need to give my voice a break. Why don't you take stage for a minute before we go back across the Pacific from the United States to Japan and take over? And what's your observation so far on this, Rex?
One of the things that I wanted to ask is I look at the medical industrial complex and the way that it's ran. I look at the pharmaceutical industry, the vaccines that are forced upon people, and, okay, well, we're going to give you a choice, but if you don't take this multitude of vaccines, then guess what? We're going to fire you, or we're not going to let your kids in this public school. So what I'm trying to figure out is, when you look at the vaccines, read every single insert that's out there, every single vaccine that's available to you that they want you to take. Read the insert. And when you look at stuff like glyphosate, genetically modified E. coli feces, why do they put aspartame in vaccines? Why do they put glyphosate in vaccines? Why do they put aluminum in vaccines? Well, they want to cause an immune response. Okay, great. You want to cause an immune response. Well, you can't even put that in food that you're going to digest as an adult, but you want to inject that into babies with multiple shots. Why? And then you look at stuff like, okay, well, there's aborted baby cells in your vaccines. Why? And then you look at some of the tests that have been done on fast food burgers, hot dogs, different meats, and they find human DNA, and then they can say, oh, well, that's just sweat, or that's just a hair from a worker. But in reality, could it actually be Soylent Green? So my point to this is, why are they injecting people into people? Why are they putting it in food and vaccines when babies don't even have a choice to decide, and they're putting people in them? It's like this disgusting, magical, black, dark sorcery, and they're not giving people a choice. So I'm trying to figure out the concept of that. There's more than the scientific value to it. It's almost like a metaphysical level.
It may very well be. Honestly, I saw just a post the other day on the timeline of a Facebook friend of mine, Judith Agard. A shout out to her. She's our co-productive correspondent on the on my programs. My executive producer, of course, is Laura Lee Solomon, who makes those programs possible. And they keep quite abreast of such subjects, more so than I do, in a contemporary day-to-day fashion of current events. And a post I saw just the other day was some kid who had been given vitamin K toxic, lethal amounts of whatever that was, some crap they tried to put in your friend's baby. And he came out totally autistic, of course, and just destroyed his life and the lives of his parents, who are now his care providers for the rest of their lives. And they'll have to find someone to be responsible for him after they die. And obviously, one can only assume there must be an agenda, but never attribute to conspiracy what so obviously is stupidity. There's corporate greed involved. There need not necessarily be an agenda. It could be just short-term desire to enforce injections on people simply because there's money to be had. And in terms of producing so many unfortunate people, the autism rates, of course, are through the roof. They're astronomical. They've skyrocketed. The majority of the population is not going to be able to function in a complex society. And by the way, I'm speaking of those that are considered baseline normal. So when we get to autism, we're talking about something that just makes it harder. But in terms of what we've got is obviously this can only lead to collapse. What would be their intent? Why would they want to engineer that when these people need a functional society to spend their money in? So you think more in terms of stupidity than you do in terms of agenda. It might be diabolic in terms of a cosmic manipulation of the agenda-driven people behind this, who are incredibly short-sighted and driven by greed. The possibility for that is there, but it's far removed enough where when we fight it, what we have to fight against is the people themselves, as opposed to the powers behind them in that regard, for that issue. When it comes to more cosmic issues like what we're discussing here, we find our answers in history, the most holy book of the Bible, and many other works and surrounding it that people have never identified with it because in their infantilism, Americans have taken this most holy book of the Bible, or rather a perverted version of it, and they are using this to basically interpret the rest of the world, which they are entirely ignorant of, through that very blinded lens. And therefore are coming up with nothing but atrocity and insanity as a result. So to get back into that, because I have nothing really to offer more at the moment, at least concerning the vaccination issues. We've gone briefly into them in the past. It's a very difficult choice for adults. I am very glad I'm not a parent. I'm very glad that I am responsible only for myself, and I can barely take care of that. So I can have nothing but admiration for anybody who sires a child and raises them. Honestly, these are the true heroes of our world. Now, in terms of the Makuya people of Japan, Makuya is the Japanese language equivalent.
Do they get 40 vaccines by the time they're 10?
I don't know what the vaccination situation is in Japan, to tell you the truth. I can only assume whatever it is doesn't seem to be producing too many autistic kids. That's something to be noted. You don't seem to have that phenomena in Japan or in too many places in the world outside of the United States. So that is of note. I mean, it's a good question. It's a valid question. But you say that in a contemporary fashion, and it's actually apropos. You may not know that, but the Makuya people of Japan are still extant. There's still an extant population in Japan. It's Japanese language equivalent for the Hebrew word for Mishkan, or the residence, which is a reference to the Holy Tabernacle. This is the portable shrine where God and man encounter per Exodus 29, verses 42 through 43. In Japan, of course, you see these little portable shrines which carry a god, a divinity. That is where that tradition comes from. And of course, this is because what happened was that the Mishkan are descendants from the people who came to Japan in 600 BC. We're talking about literally 600 years prior to the birth of Christ. And these people compiled the Japanese Empire's first Evri Nihongo, or Hebrew-Japanese language dictionary. And that was compiled, we're talking again, 600 BC, contemporaneous, the commencement of the written Nipponjin calendar, commemorating coronation of Jimmu Tenno Heika, or the first recorded emperor of Japan by Western chronometry. It being the conviction of the Mukuya, or Mishkan, or tabernacle people of Japan, who are a minority in the Japanese Empire, that the triune sacred treasures of the most ancient extant imperial dynasty on earth are Judaic relics bearing the shield of David, the six-pointed symbol of Yahuda, or Judea. It's a shield, not a star, what other people call the Star of David in their ignorance. Now, this is, of course, on the mirror, the sword, and the three treasures of Japan. I'm consciously forgetting what the third one is, a fan or something like that, but I do remember one of them being a mirror, one of them being a sword. But it was the articulated objective of the United States government in the Second World War that these three sacred relics of the Empire of Greater Japan would be destroyed. Now, these represent, of course, the Holy Trinity. These represent the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost in the Christian sense. So the Japanese crossed the Judeo-Christian barrier 600 years prior to the birth of Christ. And what the Americans wanted to do was confiscate these treasures, these artilects, or these relics, these artifacts, for scientific analysis, reverse engineering, and reproduction in Freemasonic alignment on destruction of the original reliquary as culmination of both its ethnic and genocidal policies against Japan. Now, of course, it was forced to rescind these demoniacally hubristic objectives, among so many others, when it sued for peace when the Japanese won the war. Now, this is just another sign among ultimately so many, an infinite number that I just bring up again and again and again, as to how the Americans lost the war against Japan. And of course, the Americans, the majority who listen, are in deep denial. They go into paroxysms of rage. And the reality is, of course, if the Americans had won the war, there would not be a single Japanese person left alive. I would not be here. And of course, those relics would be in the hands of the Americans, by which they would control all of you through great diabolical evil. Which was their intent of your Masonic Satanists who run the American empire through your military, medical, industrial complex. So do bear that in mind. And across the other end of Asia, of course, what we had was the Chinese emperor, the first emperor of Qin, who, as I said, ultimately went mad when the Taoist alchemists had poisoned him with mercury poisoning in his quest for immortality. And of course, Qin Shi Huang is how he's often referred to as Huang Di, the first emperor. And what he had basically given orders to was his chief Chinese alchemist, who was a Taoist by the name of Fangxi Zifu, to create an elixir of immortality using young adults or children for experimentation. He gave him no less than 3,000 young boys and girls so that he could ultimately extract from them the youth of elixir. And what Fangxi Zifu said was, Your Majesty, I need to go to Japan to do this because I can only do that using their herbal apothecary that grows within the 7,000 islands of the Empire of Wakukugoya, or the land of inner peace. The emperor gave him permission to take all 3,000 of the boys and girls, 1,500 young girls, 1,500 young boys, to Japan in order to conduct these experiments. He took them with him to Japan and he never returned. He started his own nation state in Japan by bringing these young Chinese boys and girls to intermarry into the Yamato dynasty, and he never experimented on any of them, but instead brought a new religion of Ryobo Shinto, the establishment of imperial worship, to Japan, where he felt the emperor was far more benevolent than the mad empire, or of the mad emperor, who would have sacrificed 3,000 children in his own mad quest for immortality. And that is a very important part of Japanese history. And it goes into, of course, the birth of Japan itself in terms of an ethno-religious identity. So I'm sorry, I need to give my voice a rest. If you could take over for a few moments again.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to ask you about Aleister Crowley. He actually wrote what he called his magnum opus. It's called Four, and there's 4 different books compiled in this work, and he discusses how he took blood from children for several years, and he said, well, I didn't know about writing about this, but I feel like someday it's going to have a meaning and it's going to make its worth, etc., essentially is what it said. And I thought to myself, wow, okay, so he's essentially admitting that he took blood from 8-year-olds for several years to get some type of magical work performed. And he also talks about how he did all of his karmic duties before that specific life so he could do what he did. And my question is, what's that all about? And is there kind of a similarity to what you're talking about, the blood used as some type of ritualistic embodiment or something? I don't know.
None whatsoever, because what the emperor of China, the first emperor of Qin, from whence the term China comes from, Wan Di, the Yellow Emperor, what he wanted was the extraction of DNA, though there was not a descriptive for it. He wanted to be able to rejuvenate his DNA, the dragon molecule, the serpentine molecule, which of course is that aspect which defines us as life itself, as recognized by science. There were no equivalent words for that at that time, until, of course, that element was isolated by a young Jewish female scientist, Rosalind Franklin, which wasn't until the 1950s. But they knew of it. They had hints. That's what he wanted his alchemist to derive from all of these young children. And the alchemist, of course, refused to experiment on children, so he rescued them by taking them with him to the islands of Japan. So with that, we go back to the West. And it's very important to remember that geographically, whites, Caucasians are very different from Asians and Africans. They are not the same race. We are not all one race. The current propaganda that there is only one race, the human race, is just pure shit. The existence of race is quite real. Races are different. And that doesn't mean that one is superior to the other, but all are superior to each other in various talents, functions, capabilities, and they are evolved to survive in their environments. But though the white race is different ethnically from the Asian race, geographically, all of Europe is simply a peninsula of Asia. That's why it's called Eurasia. Eurasia is considered a supercontinent. And a megacontinent would be Eurasia, Africa, united through the Mediterranean, which was ruled, of course, by the Roman Empire. Now, in terms of the Caucasian population, they are a different ethnicity that dwells on a superpeninsula of the continent of Eurasia. So all of the peninsula of Europe is just a superpeninsula with its own multiple peninsulas of Iberia, Italia, and the Balkans. And, of course, another peninsula above in the form of Scandinavia, united around a central peninsula. This superpeninsular geographic feature is given just due to cultural and racial reasons the definition of a continent. That is an indulgence. It is not a separate continent. It is no more a continent than, say, for instance, Central America or Mesoamerica. Mexico would be a separate continent from North and South America. What it is Northwest Asia. That is geographically the correct term. Very important to remember that all Europeans are Northwest Asian. So when we think of the terms of West, and it's an arbitrary division, it is a cultural division and an ethnic division, but it's not a geographic division. All of the North American continent is geographically Amerasia. The only really separate continent out of Asia is South America. Amerasia would be North America. Northwest Asia would be Europe. Australasia comprises Australia and New Zealand. Afroasia comprises the African continent. These were all part of the supercontinent of Pangaea. The only real break-off from that would be South America and Antarctica. And, of course, Greenland, which actually qualifies as a separate continent, a very large island, large enough to justify that. Now, in the West, to use a common term colloquially, but geographically in Northwest Asia, we had a man who came about, who lived from 70 to 19 BC, and his name was Publius Virgilius Maro. He's known as Virgil, the treasure of Rome. He was well known. He was a great Roman poet and philosopher who was born at Mantua in Italy, and he studied in Milan. He had a patron, which was someone who paid for him to write and live, named Maecenas, and he was friends with Octavian, who was to become the first emperor of Rome. And Virgil's last name, Virgilius, is commonly Anglo-bastardized as Virgil, which is also basically something that is associated, or the source term for the Latin term virga, which means wand. And it reinforced a belief in his prophetic powers. And, of course, we misspell that when we bastardize it in the English. Its original spelling was Virgil, as opposed to the way it's misspelt with an E in the English language. Now, three of Virgil's works that he's known for are surviving manuscripts. And they, of course, include the Georgics, which is a didactic poem on farming, using the world of the farmer as a model for the world at large. This references Adam Man. We are going to get back to that as we go into this conversation. The Aeneid he spent the last decades of his life on, and it was about the foundation of Rome. And it is, of course, one of the works he was best known for in history because, of course, it had religious importance, because he spoke of it as the founding of a holy city. Now, keep in mind, this was before the establishment of the Vatican, and St. Peter's bones were laid foundation upon to create what would become the Church of the West. And, of course, what we'll refer to most for the sake of our conversation is the eclogues. These are pastoral poems about his own day, his contemporary time. And it's his fourth messianic eclogue that was about the foretelling of the coming of Christ. And Virgil's works were well read from the Middle Ages through the present because of his foretelling of the Christ child. In the fourth book of the Eclogues, it proclaims the coming of a great Messiah-like child. And this, of course, was impressive to every scholar of the day and has been so for hundreds of years. And it is a situation which allowed his survival because it is something that many Christians were fond of, because they realized that there were noble pagans who existed before the coming of Christ, who were therefore not going to be damned on the basis of the fact that they were not Christian. Rather, that there were good people before the coming of Christ who were just as fit to go to heaven as there were who were qualified for such after the coming of Christ. In other words, this was what made all of mankind realize that Christ saved people before he was born, as well as people after he was born. Now, Dante, who wrote, of course, the Divine Comedy, talked about the descent into hell and the travels into purgatory and into heaven. He rendered Virgil basically his guide through hell and purgatory. And that's because Virgil represented the symbol of noble paganism, but also wisdom. And that shows the kind of influence that Virgil had even 1,000 years, a full millennium after his death during the age of the Renaissance. And so in terms of the ethics of Virgil's eclogues, what we have is something that if we were to take a look at it, I can read it, and I think I'll dig it up on my notes. But basically, what it talks about is the birth of a boy who will bring a golden age to the world, one in which wickedness will be taken away and the earth will be freed from fear. And this unnamed child shall receive the life of the gods, reign over a world at peace. Now, all of this is comparable to the ideas that are found in the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament. And the book of Isaiah was written about 700 BC by the Jewish prophet of that name. And the passage written by Virgil was written probably about 40 to 14 years before Christ was born, which is like just a blink of an eye in prophetic time. We're talking about something that was less than half a century prior to Christ coming into the world. And when I take a look at my notes, we have, of course, something literally that says, "Now the last age of Humea's Sibyl song has come and gone, and the majestic roll of circling centuries begins anew. Justice returns old Saturn's reign, with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. Only do thou, at the boy's birth, in whom the iron age shall cease, the golden age arise." Sometimes that's transliterated as "the iron race shall cease, the golden race arise." Under thy guidance, whatso tracks remain of our old wickedness, once done away, shall free the earth from never-ceasing fear. He shall receive the life of gods, and see heroes with gods commingling, and himself be seen of them, and with his Father's worth reign over a world at peace. And now, of course, today, recent scholarship dismisses this entirely, and they basically say that all of this is just a coincidence. And basically, this is explained by an enormous reluctance amongst modern scholars to embrace the supernatural as a possible explanation for anything. We live in a skeptical age that is pathologically so, that distrusts all things that it cannot explain and therefore dismisses them. And so there's always the risk, of course, that any scholar who takes into account the supernatural and acknowledges it will be mocked by his peers. He won't be given tenure if he makes waves with what are considered antiquated or anachronistic ideas about Eclogue 4. But be that as it may, within the academic world, I would challenge all of our viewers to consider what has been presented here and investigate it for themselves. It's not intellectually honest to dismiss the idea merely because there is a supernatural element. And a messianic interpretation, of course, is scoffed at because we have a situation in which in the West we are in a satanic environment. And therefore, the very foundations of our culture, men such as Virgil, are people who are in turn dismissed because they are prophets of their time. Honestly, the Christian monks that saved much of Western literature after the fall of Rome itself, they believed that the poem foretold the coming of Christ, and they were far closer to that event than we are today. And if they had not believed this, this culturally invaluable work would have gone to oblivion, and the cost to Western culture would have been incalculable. So this occurred, of course, during the time when Judea, where Christ was born, was under the rule of a psychotic madman that was known as Herodas, or Herod, as he's Anglo-bastardized in terms of name, Herod the Great. And he was called Herod the Great not because he was a good man, but because he built great monuments, including the Second Temple of Jerusalem. He's the Herod, of course, who killed all boys under 2 years of age in Bethlehem after Jesus was born there. And this occurred, of course, because the Romans put him in charge after putting down the Judean and Parthian revolt against their rule. What they had was an Iranian insurgency. The Parthians were considered an insurgency. They are, of course, Iranian. They were arming the Jews, something we would today consider quite ironic. And because they revolted against Roman rule, Rome appointed Herod, the king of Judea, or more properly in his own language, Herodes. Herod had complete authority. He used it ruthlessly. He established an enormous secret police force brutally killing anyone suspected of plotting against him. He enforced the Pax Romanum, the Peace of Rome, by slaughtering all dissidents. Now, he was known, and this is why he was appointed, as a mighty whirlwind warrior. This meant he was kind of like the Jewish version, if you will, even though he was not ethnically Jewish, of a Scandinavian or Viking berserker. And of course, he was known as renown in battle, which meant that obviously he killed a lot of people personally due to his own combat skills, as well as serving as a tyrannical dictator who killed people en masse. So he came from an alienated family, a foreign family that had been enthroned over the tribes of Judea as guardian of the Temple Mount and builder of the Second Temple of Jerusalem. And this would span about half a century, 46 years under Roman sponsorship. And it was something that it was what ultimately made him a superhero in modern Israeli eyes, because he gave them all kinds of monumental evidence of greatness that the Jews would otherwise not have. The Jews were the people of the book, not monument builders. And as a result, he gave them something that made them equal to other cultures that had pyramids, that had cultural shrines like the Japanese have at Ise, like the kind of tomb of the emperor they have in China. This made the Jews, or the Israelis, who took advantage of this heritage, people who had a culture in their own right, aside from that which they could only speak of. It gave them something solid to stand on. And the Jews, or the Israelis rather, who are not Jews, other than for the Sephardim who might live in Israel, the majority of them are ethnically Turkic as opposed to Semitic, they, of course, have even considered putting his likeness on their coinage and on their currency. That's how much he's admired. And yet he's the man who tried to kill your Christian God. This is how different the Jewish God is from your Christian God. Just keep that in mind. This is very important. So what we have, of course, is Herodotus Magnus was definitely security conscious. He was pathologically paranoid. So he built many fortresses throughout the Holy Land to provide himself sanctuary within expeditious distance of wherever he might be within his realm at any given time. So each of these fortresses is architecturally unique, and along with their aqueducts, their theaters, other public building projects, they raised the prosperity of Israel at that time to the point where his subject populace came to worship and appreciate him because of the economy. And the vast majority, as I said, of all the popular tourist sites in present-day Israel were built by this son of a bitch who tried to kill your God. So that's very important to remember. Anybody who tries to look this up, reference Matthew chapter 22, verse 16, Mark 3, verse 6, or Mark 12, verse 13. Now, as Ere, the mother of Heracles, from whence he took his name, Heracles was from the goddess Ere, once schemed to kill the baby Hercules, so too did the son of the anti-father, the anti-god, anti-pastor, the Idumean, the Edomite, the descendant of the ancient racial enemy of Israel, and Chypros, or Kypros. Very similar to the pronunciation of the Persian king Koresh. Kypros was a Nabatean, an Arab of noble descent. Basilius, King Herodotus, Herod Magnus the Great, the Roman-appointed client king of Judea, he ordered the murder of the Son of God. And that, of course, is chronicled in the Holy Book in Matthew chapter 2, Luke chapter 1, and Acts chapter 23. Now, who were the Edomites? And I've used that term before with the anti-gods that the American high command of your military junta worships. They are known in occult language as the kings of Edom. That simply means symbolically that they are the racial enemies of all the human beings who cleave to the religion that was manifest in fulfillment of its prophecy in Israel at that time. And so these racial enemies of man are your military junta, your high command, who worship the kings of Edom, the anti-gods that were referenced by Howard Phillips Lovecraft as Al-Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth. These are actual anti-gods that are referenced, of course, in the holy book of the Quran. They are referenced as Shaitan, or the Islamic word for Satan. Shaitan is Al-Cthulhu. Shaitan is the forsaker. That is what Cthulhu means in the Arabic. The forsaker, the abandoner, who abandons, forsakes all of its believers. This is what your military high command worships. Now, all of this, of course, can be dealt with by taking a look at Michael Aquino, the officially recognized satanic chaplain of all branches of the American Armed Services and Forces, not just the United States Army, of which he was a part. He wrote the Chaplain's Handbook for all services, the United States Coast Guard, the Marine Corps, the Navy, and the Army and the Air Force. And all of this comes from his worship, ultimately, of Al-Cthulhu. He very much worked with what Americans dismiss as Lovecraftian, so they can pump it all onto a pulp fiction author and say, oh, it sources from one man's mind. Well, what they ignore is historically the fact that Howard Phillips Lovecraft had converted to Islam at a very early point in his life, however transitionally, and studied the Quran very deeply. We're talking about an autodidact who had a magnificent IQ, who learned to read at the age of 9 and wrote columns on astronomy, not astrology, but astronomy, for his local paper at the age of 12 or 14. From the age of 12 to 14, he was writing columns which were internationally read and recognized by scientists of his day. This man had, for a period of time, converted to Islam, read the original Quran, and, of course, had learned about such entities as Al-Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth. And it is that which Michael Aquino worshipped and promoted through his chaplain's handbook to the armed forces, not in that these names are named, but in the fact that he orders all Jewish rabbis, all Catholic fathers, all Protestant deacons, everyone who was a religious specialist in the United States Armed Services was ordered to step back and stand down whenever a satanic chaplain showed up. And that is the main purpose of the chaplain's handbook, is to emphasize those orders in all branches of service so his men could summon these anti-gods on the field of battle, as they did in Iraq during Operation Desert Storm when I was there. And all of the men who surrendered said many of them had cited such entities on the field of battle, which was why the entire Iraqi army, which had survived 8 years of war against Iran, was one of the largest armies in the world. Almost as large as that of the Soviet Union. After 8 years of war and mobilization, it was like the 4th largest army in the world. And it disintegrated within a matter of hours into the smallest army in Iraq because of the entities that they were confronted with, the kings of Edom, summoned by Michael Aquino in his last act of active duty service to the United States. None of this is admirable. This was the forsaking of God itself, which your military does not fight under. Your military fights under the realm of the anti-gods and the orders of them. So,
how do you overcome that?
You overcome that, of course, by, first off, resisting, of course, Michael Aquino and resisting what he promotes, which is the idea that America won the Second World War. All of these other propaganda campaigns that have been indoctrinated into you about the American empire being on the side of right in any conflict, which historically it has not been, from the American Revolutionary War of Independence, which was the longest declared war in American history prior to the Second World War, through World War I, through World War II. America has been on the side of evil and wrong. Once you recognize that, you resist passively. You pay your taxes, but you don't allow your sons to respond to a draft. You certainly... Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you pay your taxes, though, aren't you a part of the system? Because you're paying money into a system that's feeding this beast, essentially, right?
You are, but there is nothing to be done for it because resistance would invite yourself being put into jail and you would be of no use to anyone. You're of far greater use outside of jail and being able to spread awareness of what your taxes are paying for. What you need to do outside of jail is lobby for the dismantling of the United States military, period. You don't need it. I've said before on our past conversations how many guns are in the United States, how many hunters we have that comprise the largest army in the world. You do not need these military men who have never won a single war. All of it falls down on you, militia man, not a bunch of paramilitary constitutional fundamentalists, but you, the average tax-paying American citizen who maintains his right to bear arms and hunt. Now, some of these hunters might be members of militia, but that's not the ideology you need to cleave to. The ideology you need to cleave to is a healthy understanding of Christianity. And that will separate you from the Satanism of your founding fathers of this cursed republic. That is how you pay your taxes. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto Christ what is the Lord's. That is how you resist. And of course, that brings us back, of course, to, did you have any questions about Lovecraft, by the way?
I did, because Lovecraft has written several Necronomicon type books. Some people say they're fiction, some people say they're nonfiction. Is it nonfiction or is it fiction? Is it all of the above? What's the deal with what he's put together? Because a very mystical author, to say the least.
Well, it's very important to remember that much misinformation is spread about Howard Phillips Lovecraft to occult, which means to occlude, to hide. Occlusion is a visual occlusion like an eclipse. Occult means to, it's an astronomical term. It's used for eclipses. The occult means what is hidden. Howard Phillips Lovecraft has been occulted. One of the ways that they occult him is by claiming he was an atheist. And of course, what Howard Phillips Lovecraft was someone who was non-theistic, but he was not an atheist. And it's like Buddha, or Buddhism, the religion, is technically an atheistic religion. The Buddha was never asking anyone to worship him. Buddha did not say he was God. Buddha simply introduced a new way of life that had no gods. Therefore, technically, Buddhism is an atheistic religion. Does that mean a Buddhist is an atheist? Of course not. A Buddhist is religious, but a Buddhist is not worshiping Buddha, and he's also not necessarily worshiping, the God of the Bible. However, Christ himself said that all such religious people are, that all religions other than anti-Christ religions or anti-godly religions, diabolic religions, are of God, that God is in all these religions, including the pagan Norse religions. Which were, of course, to become active throughout the Middle Ages. And, of course, what we have in terms of Howard Phillips Lovecraft was a man who never wrote the Necronomicon. The Necronomicon was being referenced as a tulpa. The Necronomicon did not exist. The Necronomicon is, of course, forged. It is forged by any number of authors. And these authors, of course, are forging what might have been produced by Abdul al-Hazred, which is a historical figure. Take some going into in another time. We'll do that in another discussion when we go deep into the anti-gods. But the reality is, of course, the figures who try to forge these documents are people like Peter Levinda. And I can say that without worry of legal complications because Peter Levinda, of course, has been incontrovertibly linked to the production of the so-called Simon Necronomicon. Now, this was done under direct orders of Michael Aquino. And what Michael Aquino wanted to create was a booby-trap book to destroy lives, a book that would misinform occultists of what safety measures to use so that every time they summoned an entity, they would be unable to ward it off and be unable to send it back. So it is a gate book to open portals endlessly and ceaselessly into our world of the entities that Michael Aquino worships. That is the secret of the Necronomicon. The Simon Necronomicon, as written by Peter Levinda, is the real deal in the sense that is a book purposefully forged by Peter Levinda to destroy its users. If you purchase a copy of it and you attempt to use it, you're a fool. More than that, you're an enemy of humanity who is seeking its destruction, as Peter Levinda and Michael Aquino are. That is what you need to take home as a lesson concerning the Necronomicon. Now, in terms of the Edomites as a people occupied the land south of the Dead Sea. Edomites were the descendants of Esau, the older twin brother of Jacob, whom God later renamed Israel, and whose 12 sons became the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, of course, that genealogy is gone into in Genesis chapter 36. There's no need for myself to cover it, verses 1 through 9. But how did they come to rule over the Jews? In 47 BC, Julius Caesar appointed Antipater, Antifather, the son of the Edomite governor of Edom, to be the governor of Judea. Herodes Magnus, was one of Antipater's two sons. In 40 BC, 40 years before the coming of the Christ, when Virgil was writing his eclogues. Parthians, today's Iranians, attacked the Roman Empire's eastern fringes, and they briefly conquered Judea. Herodes escaped to Rome, where the Roman Senate named him King of the Jews and commissioned him to retake Judea, which he did in 37 BC as a whirlwind warrior, as a berserker of his day. And of course, he was someone who was a secular ruler, technically, but he impacted the religion. He was Arab by blood, he was Jewish by religion, he was Roman by citizenship, and he was king of Judea by trade. He's referenced as the evil genius of the Judean nation, and of course the hero to modern Israel. So we have in him an example of all the worst that echoes down today. He's reviled quite literally as an abortive antichrist within the churches, and he's someone who, of course, is indirectly worshipped by Americans who support the state of Israel. So if you go around in Israel to see all of these magnificent works, you're a Herodosian. You're a worshiper of Herodes Magnus, the Antichrist, the man who wanted to kill your God. But this is what Americans do, because he was one of the most energetic builders of the ancient world. Undeniably, of course, guiding his kingdom to new heights of prosperity and power. And as secular ruler of the Jews, he practiced Judaism as a religious, as opposed to ethnic Jew, per the demands of political expediency. And as the son of a Jewish convert of Gentile background, he also knew how to act the part as king of Judea. Many Edomites and Nabateans had been assimilated by the Jews through Israeli military conquests back in the day, and had, of course, perforce adopted their customs. And these Judaized Edomites were never really accepted by the Jewish peoples as the dominant Pharisaic tradition. But Herodes managed or considered himself of the Jewish faith. So he was not considered Jewish by the religiously observant or bigotedly nationalist Jews of biblical Judea, but he was considered, of course, the man who somehow was placed in charge of their religion and built their second temple of Jerusalem. So we have here a corrupted religion. So anyone who thinks that a return to this kind of corrupted religion with the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem is a positive is obviously Antichrist. And that is what most Americans want. They want that from a man who was Herod. They want his works to be reinstitutionalized because he controlled the sacrificial cult by placing a lackey in the position of high priest. And in any of his appointees, if they were foolish enough to displease him, Herodes had them killed and replaced with another lackey. So with the Old Testament will defined as the Jews, defined in Hebrews of the Bible, it was of godly covenant with the nation of the chosen people, the Israelites, the children of Abraham, and an accessible summarization of the Old Testament covenant is probably best found in Exodus chapter 34. It set merciless precedent for swift and wrathful judgment against any who defied Herodes throughout the book of Jewish scriptures. It's understandable in light of all of that, that Herodes the Great refused to believe that the warlike and genocidal Kwana Yahweh, the jealous God, would choose to come as a humble child. And Herodes logically assumed that this King of Kings Jesus, bearing Joseph of Nazareth, was a royal Hasmonean birth child. That he came through his blessed mother, the Theotokos, Madonna Miriam, as out of the line of David. Now, of course, everybody denies that in this day and age. All of the scholars and the overwhelming majority of Jews say Jesus Christ could never have come from the house of David. He was not a son of the king of David. Well, that's really effing funny, because Herod, who was right there on the spot as the appointed king of the Jews under the Roman Empire, was sure as hell convinced he was. And he was a lot closer to the subject than anyone is today. And he was so convinced this boy was the direct descendant of King David that he had every son of a bitch under 2 years of age killed, who was a male child, to keep this guy from taking his place. Now, that's a pretty serious response for somebody who's acting on a mere suspicion. So all of today's Jewish scholars obviously are acting from an almost diabolic level of denial. That is beyond insane, that level of denial, based on the history that we know. But this is what Americans accept, and because Americans do not worship the Christ at all. They don't follow Christ, they worship the Jew. We'll dismiss that for a moment, because I've spoken of that fairly in depth before, that phenomena of American Jew worship. And we have to understand that Herodotus, on the spot, was acting previously and at that time on Old Testament prophecy of the Abrahamic bloodline descending from King David through the sainted Lady Miriam and Joseph. It was promised that from the house of David, the Christly Moshiach, Christ is a title, it means the anointed Messiah, would be virgin born. And the proto-Machiavellian Herodotus had deposed the Jewish Hasmonean Maccabean, the Maccabean dynasty. When he took over with Roman reinforcements, he captured Yerushalayim, or Jerusalem, and condemned the last legitimate king of biblical Judea, the Jewish priest Antigonus II Matthias, or Matityahu, the last Hasmonean king of the Maccabees, or the Maccabees. He's, of course, written of in the Bible. He committed him to execution, Herodotus did, under jurisdiction of the Republican administration of Marcus Antony, the same Marcus Antony, Magister Equitum Quaestor and Tribune, who was the consul of the Roman Republic, who was in bed with the last of the pharaohs, Queen Cleopatra. And he suicided with his lover eventually, because unfortunately for all humanity, they lost the war, the civil war of the Roman Empire. And Rome became a monocultural garrison state that was precedent to Stalin in its policies, as opposed to the multicultural or progressive empire that they would have ushered in together. But aside from that misfortune, it was understandably quite difficult for contemporary Jews to accept the Christ child as the Lord Savior, Mashiach, Messiah, the king of both their people and their faith, whilst such a demonstrably impressive Edomite sat on the Davidian throne, providing both national security and profitable construction contracts. New Testament Israel was the Dubai of its day. It was the Empire of Roma was not energy dependent on petroleum. The imperial engine was fueled by human slavery, chattel slaves, the ergonomics of human labor. And it was delivered via the mechanism of military conquest and the forced enslavement of entire nations. And where were they traded? At the time of Christ, these bondservants were exported out of Judea under the king of Edom. And of course, it was the same market manipulative manner that is used in the way Dubai exports oil today, with the resultant boom in property development as monetary returns were domestically vested in infrastructure. So at that time, the god Quana, Yahweh, jealous Jehovah of Abraham, established a new testimonial covenant of will with all humanity in their stead, wherein there is godly grace where there was once divine wrath. He gave up on the Jewish people for their sins in that regard. Now, that's where the 12 kings, the star child, and the universal religion begin to manifest. We are going to discuss the sage kings of China and the star child, Jesus Christ himself, as originally seen in a star. An introduction, of course, of yourselves to the revelation of the Magi, an ancient Christian deuterocanonical work, an apocryphon, to which Americans have never been introduced. And yet every Christmas we hear the story of three wise men. It's one of the most familiar and beloved parts of the Christmas story. And of course, as the centuries have passed, traditions have become somewhat distorted. Half-truths have been spread by disinformationists and even Satanists in an attempt to distort your view of what your religion is. And by the 3rd century, when we were still close to the advent of the Messiah himself, after he had conducted his mission on earth, they were already associated with Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the 3 sons of Noah, and thus with Asia, Africa, and Europe. That's why at Christmas time today, you see them looking like the Mod Squad. Oh, here's a black guy, a white guy, and a yellow guy, and they're all there before Jesus, and that might be commendable in the sense of race relations, but it has nothing to do with history. So it's very important to correct that, because for all their popularity, these travelers from the East, known as the Magi, they appear in only a short passage of the New Testament, following a star to the site of Jesus' birth, bringing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so we're going to go into, of course, their story now. Does it bring to mind anything with yourself before I dive into this? Because this, of course, is what takes us into the meat of our discussion, the heart of what we're discussing in terms of the theme of Christmas. And, of course, I'm certain that you've had impressions of Christmas all your life that might need some expressing.
Well, one thing I'm wondering about Christmas is the date that's chosen, December 25th. I've heard a lot of different analogies towards that specific date. So could you describe that?
I really think it's not even of any importance.
It's not connected to like the god of Ra or the Egyptian deity.
You know, a lot of these hypotheses are brought up by pseudo-theologians, and what we have to admit is the fact that we have had multiple calendars in the advent of human development, and that these calendars have become synthesized and conflated in the most inefficient of fashions. December 25th is at this point quite arbitrary. It's an important part of the celebration of Christ because it is the darkest part of the year. And out of that darkest part of the year will emerge, of course, light, rebirth. That's why it's important that the celebration take place around this time, whether or not Christ was born on that exact date. We can never get the exact date because of the multiple changes we've had in calendar. Most, of course, specifically from the Julian calendar of Julius Caesar to the Gregorian calendar. Very important to remember that my church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, is a branch of course, the Byzantine Orthodox Church of Byzantium, the Church of Constantinople, the original Christian church. And they used the Julian calendar, the Khazarian calendar, until, like, literally the Russian Revolution, until 1917 and 19 when the communists took over. Until that point in time, they were on a totally different calendrical system from that of the West, which was the Gregorian calendrical system as established by the Pope of Rome, Pope Gregory. That's why it's called Gregorian. So obviously, you lose days, you lose weeks. Astronomers still use the Julian calendar because the Julian calendar is far more accurate for predicting astronomical phenomena as we were predicting them using the Julian calendar centuries before Pope Gregory changed the bloody calendar. So if you go to astronomical sites, you're going to see Julian calendrical dates, and then they have to translate it into Gregorian dates in order to accurately monitor thousands of years worth of astronomical phenomena, which takes place over millions of years. So that's part of what you're dealing with. And then people ascribe all kinds of stupid things to this, like, oh, this is really pagan. Oh, this is really Babylonian. Oh, this was really absorbed by Nimrod. It doesn't matter that these were formerly pagan holidays that were usurped by new Christian traditions. That does not destroy the need for this tradition as expressed under the Spirit of Christ. For you to dismiss the holiday of either Easter, because it sources from the word Ishtar, a pagan goddess of fertility, during the time of the rebirth of Christ, it is representative. It is metaphorical. This is the infantile literalism we're going to address more deeply as we get into this. Does that make sense so far? Does that contextualize it well enough for now?
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's take a look at some of these verses and what they give us out of Matthew. In Matthew chapter 2 is where we find the mention of the kings, and their number is never given. It doesn't say there were 3 of them. In Matthew chapter 2, starting with verse number 11, the tradition was that there were 3 wise men, which simply arose from the fact that the Bible mentions 3 gifts. But the Bible doesn't say how many wise men made the journey to see young Jesus. The idea that they were also kings came from the imagery of Isaiah, chapter 60, verse 3. In the second verse of chapter 2 of Matthew, the wise men were guided to look for the King of the Jews by a miraculous stellar event, the Star of Bethlehem, which they called his star. His star. They traveled thousands of miles to worship him. Now, by verse 10, they doggedly follow the star, which leads them to Jesus. They follow God's guidance joyfully. They consult with King Herodes, the pathological murderer in Jerusalem, concerning the birth of Christ, and are directed by him to Bethlehem. Now, they recognize Christ as the Messiah when he is still a child. Their gifts are quite costly, and they worship him, literally. Go to their knees, get on the ground on their hands and knees before him, and worship him. Now, this, of course, is a miraculous event in and of itself. In Matthew, verse 12 of chapter 2, God warns them in a dream against returning to Herodes Magnus, Herod the Great. And so, in defiance of that king, they leave Judea by another route after they have honored their king, the King of Kings. Now, many modern religious scholars claim they never existed. Matthew says only that the visitors come from the east, and scholars have conveniently assumed that they came from Persia, Arabia, perhaps at the absolute furthest from India. Matthew reveals nothing of these visitors' ancestry, but their names have become legendary. Gasper or Casper, Melchior, and Balthasar. Balthasar has a Persian sound, so it's been presumed that these men were scholars from Iran because supposedly only thusly being in the vicinity could they have been familiar with Daniel's prophecy about the Messiah or anointed one in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, at least according to the New International Version of the Bible. Now, as for the Magi in the Bible, the only reference in the Bible to these wise men in this second chapter of the Gospel of Matthew can be quoted in its fullness. And I think that it's best to do that right now so people get an image of how little they know about these men. And so we'll start with verse 1, and I'll go through the 12 sentences, and it's just 12 sentences, but they're important. 1. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born of the King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. When Herod the king heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all of the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. And they said unto him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, let me see if I can remember that. It's more correctly, And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah. For out of thee shall come a governor, and that shall rule my people Israel. And these came from the advisors to King Herod himself. Then Herod, back to the biblical quotation, when he had privily called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. And when he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go forth and search diligently for the young child, and when ye have found them, bring me word again that I may come and worship him also. When they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned of God in a dream, in this 12th verse, that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. Now, it's through the first ever English translation and detailed analysis of this very little known 2nd century manuscript of a story that was written by some of the original Christians, we've uncovered a far more substantial version of the wise men history. And that, of course, is that as early as the 2nd century, a Syrian Christian author or a group of Christians in a kind of an enclave, they penned this remarkable work that was called The Revelation of the Magi. It was written in Syriac. It's the language related to Aramaic, Jesus' own tongue, and Syrian scholars were the first Arabs to translate Greek philosophy, literature, and medical texts. They were then translated from Syriac into Arabic and then taken to medieval Spain, where they were translated into Latin. Christian theologians were blessed by the insights of Greek philosophy because of the efforts of great Muslim scholars. Only during the Renaissance did Europeans have access to the original Greek texts because of the fall of Constantinople, the fall of Byzantium, due to the Muslim invasions. So all of that needs to be taken into account in the history that we're going into, the debt that is owed the Muslims, as well as the threat that they have presented. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas, if you don't know St. Thomas Aquinas, you don't know philosophy. He was profoundly influenced by Aristotle and the Muslim philosopher Averroes, whom he simply called the philosopher, as in the epitome, and the commentator. Now, the revelation of the Magi was well known and honored by medieval Christians, like St. Thomas Aquinas, and Aquinas cited its authority in Summa Theologica, Quatrain 36, Article 5, and dozens of artists depicted details from its text in their paintings of the Magi. The revelation states that there were 12 Magi, not 3, and many of these paintings from that time of St. Thomas Aquinas show a large number of them in enormous caravans. Now, according to the revelation of the Magi, the Apostle Thomas visited the wise men in their home country of Shia, located in the extreme east of the world, which literally means that they were at the shore of the great ocean. That's how it's described, meaning the Pacific. The Pacific is the greatest ocean on Earth. The Pacific covers the majority of the world's surface, the majority of the surface of our planet. Of course, its name means the ocean of great peace, the Pacific, as in pacifist. And of course, that is where the wise men came from, the eastern edge of the world on stride the shore of the ocean of great peace. Now, wise men, of course, is a translation of the Greek magoi, magi, which literally means magician. But the revelation explains it means those who pray in silence. In the revelation of the Magi, we find out the original root word, which comes from the Chinese language. And what it means is like a warrior monk or a martial artist who meditates. Now, nowhere in the scripture are the Magi called kings, but in the revelation of the Magi, they do lay down their crowns when they bow to the Christ child. So we know that they are of nobility. These are true noble warriors. These are the Chinese version of samurai. Now, Landau, who is an interpreter of the Syriac language, Brent Landau is a Harvard theologian who now works at the University of Oklahoma. He actually discovered or recovered this manuscript from the Vatican Library during his pursuit of a doctoral degree. And he basically revealed the fact that it was written from the Magi's own point of view. It is a personal experience story that is related by someone in the 2nd century, literally 100 years after Christ lived, which in historical terms is, again, the blink of an eye. It's like yesterday after Christ. Now, he was an expert, Brent Landau, the Harvard professor who I speak of, in biblical ancient languages. He was one of the few experts in the Syriac. He found references to this text about the wise men in writings from the Middle Ages Originally, he learned that a collector in the 18th century had discovered it in a Turkish monastery, and it was a manuscript, the Revelation of the Magi, a narrative of the wise men. This collector gave it to the Vatican Library, where the document, which was written on vellum, which is kid skin, meaning the skin of a young goat, which is called a kid. And the skin of a young goat was compressed till it's transparent and translucent. And it's a very valuable kind of parchment, one of the most expensive types. So this book was something that was an enormous investment in its day in terms of making. And it remained archived away in virtual obscurity in the Vatican Library for hundreds of years. And originally, of course, they found out in their trail that it came from Egypt, where there was preserved by the Coptic peoples. The Coptic peoples were some of the first people in the world to convert to Christianity. And the Coptic peoples, of course, are a ethnic as well as a religious minority in Egypt that are persecuted in the same manner that Jews were persecuted many times in history as an ethnic and religious minority. The Copts, however, are Egyptian Christians, and they have come to dominate much of the education of the Egyptian society. They have come to dominate a lot of its bookkeeping, and as a result, it's one of those things where they are hence resented and persecuted, and they are the people who originally took the book and saved it from destruction. Now, basically, it makes you wonder, of course, just how much else is in the Vatican Library. If you're in there, think of what other documents that might shape and expand our views are just rotting away on a shelf for hundreds of years at a time. And again, when we investigate the trail of how this book got there, it was collected in Egypt by a man named G.S. Assamani, an 18th century Orientalist who worked for the Vatican Library. He was hired as a mercenary archaeologist to collect artifacts. And as the Indiana Jones of his day, he brought it to Rome, where it resides to this day. No one approached it because most scholars said it had no historical value. The text was preserved in Syriac, which a language was used by ancient Christians, but it's one which almost nobody ever studied, and certainly no one was fluent. Landau was the first man to crack the code and become fluent in the Syriac language in hundreds and hundreds of years. And his translation is also, of course, the first to appear in English. And he did it, of course, in tandem and co-reference with a Cambridge scholar, J.F. Coakley. And so no matter what one says about historical value, the Revelation contains a valuable message of tolerance that's as much needed today as it was during its years of composition. So as part of his doctoral dissertation at Harvard Divinity School, Landau spent 7 years translating and analyzing this text. And he basically worked from both a 1927 published text in Syriac and the original document at the Vatican, which, of course, he had to return when he was done. And this is what brings us, of course, to what you spoke of earlier, metaphor, the language of metaphor as opposed to literalism, that the world is 2,000 years old and that Satan put all the dinosaur bones in the ground so that he could test your faith. Okay, this is the insanity of Fred Flintstone, where we've got guys who are farming with dinosaurs that they're using as tractors. And of course, the guy who builds the replica of Noah's Ark over there in Fantasyland is using modern construction techniques to put together this monstrosity that, of course, he should have been using biblical techniques to reconstruct. Okay, this is the insanity of infantilism. You don't have religion, you have a theme park. And that is American religion. It's theme park religion. And all of this is based on infantilism of you want a Disneyland God. And the way you get it is by visiting Israel and seeing all the ruins that were built by the very man who tried to kill your God. That's how crazy you are, America. And so when we get into this metaphor versus insanity, let's take a look at the Bible that we were speaking about. You have a combination of an Old Testament and a New Testament. Now, my father was a sailor. He was a sailor all of his life for well over 30 years. And he served in 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, though, of course, technically the Korean Peninsular conflict and the Vietnam counterinsurgency were not legally declared wars. They were, of course, monstrous commitments of manpower and equipment and materials that resulted in the death of millions of people, civilian and military. And those three conflicts are engraved upon his tombstone, rightfully provided by the Veterans Administration. So his headstone literally says World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He's one of the few three-war veterans in American history. So my late and sainted father, of course, is someone who was baptized a Catholic. He was a lapsed Catholic. He took me to church oftentimes when I was young, tried to take my sister, who refused to go, was very intimidated. Ultimately, of course, he did less and less practice of that sort, and of course began to speak to priests again prior to his death for confession, etc. And but other than that, he never had myself baptized within the Roman Catholic Church. So he maintained a very kind of progressive attitude about my following of the faith. But because he was such a nautical enthusiast, someone who had been a sailor all of his life, the best analogy I could think of as an allegory for what the situation we are confronted with the Bible is the fact that my father would read nautical books that were of immense depth and value, such as Moby Dick or Mutiny on the Bounty. Now, if I were to take Moby Dick, that is what is referenced in a genre, as faction, meaning that it is fiction based on fact, meaning it's a dramatization of historical reality. Now, Moby Dick is based on a very real whalers phenomenon, where whales are so intelligent as some of the most intelligent mammals, far more intelligent than man, with a far bigger brain in many respects, in so many ways. Here's this species that has been known to hunt down whaling ships, crash into them, destroy them, and then individually hunt down the whale boats on which people escaped as life rafts, and kill all of these whale boats by capsizing them and sinking their men individually, sometimes to the point of devouring the men or swallowing them, even though whales do not eat meat. They're essentially shrimp eaters. They eat microscopic plankton, and for all intents and purposes may as well be vegetarian. They're eating food that would be far different from what would go inside of your mouth. And yet when they're angry enough, they will devour people in an act of vengeance. They can be driven to that by the hideous atrocity of whaling. So this is a historical fact, and it was on that precedent, historically, that Moby Dick was based in dramatization. Now, Mutiny on the Bounty, on the other hand, is an actual historical incident. Captain Bligh, of course, was captain of his ship. There was a mutiny. The mutineers hijacked the bounty. They dropped Captain Bligh off in a lifeboat so he and the staff could escape. He made it back to England. He led a manhunt where he captured all of the mutineers that he could for execution. Those that escaped to an island known as Pitcairn Island, which was not on the maps, not on the charts. They took a bunch of women with them so they could rape them repeatedly and have something to do aside from basically killing and eating each other. And the end result was Pitcairn Island today is populated by the products of a ceaseless chain of generational incest. Pitcairn Island is a horror story where people are constantly raping each other and basically abusing each other in horrific manner, the remnants of this mutiny on the Bounty. Now that nightmare, that never-ending waking nightmare, is a product of that mutiny, which was recorded in a history thereof, the Mutiny on the Bounty. Now, that's all fact, with repercussions to this day. Now, we take that fact book and we weld it in a single volume to Moby Dick, and we say everything in this faction book, the dramatization of these whaling incidents, is the inalterable word of God. And that is something to be taken as the basis and foundation for everything you read in Mutiny on the Bounty. So everything in Mutiny on the Bounty has to be contextualized within the unutterable word of divinity as presented in Moby Dick. So you've got faction being used as the basis for nonfiction, and you would come up with what commercial illustrators, we used to use this term professionally, would call a camel, which is an ugly thing. And it doesn't work. It is something, camels work, but not as art projects. And this is something that doesn't make any sense. That's your Old Testament and your New Testament. Your New Testament is the God who has a covenant with all humanity. Your Old Testament is a psychotic entity that is ordering carnage and genocide. This is an Old Testament God who's so bloodthirsty, it's demanding the sacrifice of firstborn sons, and it's demanding the genocide of peoples that are outside of the tribe of Judah. It calls, of course, for the land of Canaan to be annihilated, burned to the root, the slaughter of every blade of grass, every grasshopper that's hanging on every blade of grass. Every human being needs to be burned. In the ancient Greek language, this was called holocaustos, Holocaust. Now, the Christians developed a violent form of warfare known as crusade. The Muslims developed a violent form of warfare known as jihad. In the modern sense, both of these could be taken peacefully. Televangelists hold crusades so that they can pump for funding, and they hold crusades to campaign for evangelical conversion of new believers, and there's nothing violent in that. Muslims can go on jihad as a quest for an inner spiritual journey. But when it comes to the military variants of jihad and crusade, men, women, children, entire nations can be put to the sword and the torch. The Jewish version of jihad or crusade is Holocaust, holocaustos, that was used to clarify their military campaigns for violent genocide of other nation states. When they were expelled from Egypt and needed to take a new plot of land or real estate on which to set up camp, the primary primo real estate with shoreside property was Canaan. Of course, the Canaanites didn't want to give up their seaside property and their farmland, so God ordered the Jews, well, kill them all and burn them as a proper sacrifice unto me, so that not an ash of them remains. That's what's called a Holocaust. That's the Greek term for mass sacrifice by fire. Just as the Jews were later mass sacrificed by fire in the ovens at Dachau and Auschwitz, based on the precedent they had set at Canaan, where they killed every man, woman, and child and burned them, many of them alive, into mass sacrifice for God. Is that God your God? If so, you're a Satanist. So that God of the Jews is not your God. Your Christian God would never give that order. Now, of course, people who try to take the Bible literally today, the biblical literalists, will say, well, God got a lot nicer as he got older. Well, that's absurd, because my God is outside of space and time. My God is not slave circuited to a chronology. This is what Americans are slave circuited to. This is why they're eschatological. This is why they're obsessed with end times. Because if I had a God like that, I'd want time to end too. But that's why they don't worship the God of Christ. They worship the Jews and the God of the Jews. A tribal God, a war God, a God of blood and fire. Now, that's why Americans have to say, I'm a Christian and I follow Christ. And when Christ came to earth, when God came to earth, all of that was nothing to do anymore with the Jewish people and everything to do with what I am seeking. So in terms of this, what you have is this New Testament God, and this is your foundation for Christianity. And the Old Testament has to be looked on the way we look at Moby Dick. It's a conflation of Canaanite, Syrian, Babylonian, Assyrian, various Semitic peoples' mythos and mythologies, also together as basically distorted, stolen, absorbed by the conquering Jews in the various Holocausts. And this is what created the monstrous Frankensteinian God of Abraham, the same kind of bloodthirsty entity that demanded sacrifices as unto Moloch of Carthage. Your God is not that God. And your God knows, because he's outside of time and space, that the only way you could understand him was to come to earth as you, as a man, and suffer what men suffer. If your God didn't die and suffer what men suffer, pain, death, love, sex, he could never communicate with you. And it's only by coming to earth and hanging out with the poor, the impoverished, the conditions of the majority of all humanity, suffering, love and pain and death, that your God, as Jesus Christ, brought you salvation, because there's no other way he could do that other than in the form of a man. And therefore, of course, that God becomes the God you need to relate to. Now, where the insanity comes in further is the perversion by the British, the original evil empire, ruled, of course, by people who became the rulers of over a quarter of the world. And one of the first of these madmen was Henry VIII. And Henry VIII was a serial killer. Henry VIII married a woman, got tired of her, and said, I want a divorce, and I want somebody else to screw. And in those days, you couldn't get a divorce unless you got a letter from the Pope. And when he wrote to the Pope, hey, Papa, I'm sick of this bitch, and I want to screw someone else. The Pope said, well, that's not good enough for me, son. So I deny you a divorce. And then King Henry VIII said, well, F you, Papa, I'm going to get a divorce, so I'm going to start a new religion. So he said, I'm going to start the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And after that, he had all his wives killed, went through what, how many, 7, 8, 9? He accused them of the vilest of crimes, including incest, as a pretense for having them executed so he could bring another bitch on the throne and be screwing somebody else. That's the birth of the Church of England. And then you had a son of a bitch after that called King James I. And King James I said, you know what? I'm tired of this Latin in the Bible because I'm too stupid to read Latin. I keep failing the Latin test. The priests say that I'm retarded, you know, because I'm the product of people like King Henry VIII who just screw everything in sight, and I don't even know which mother I've got and shit. So he says, you know what? I'm going to hire these guys from Oxford and Cambridge. We're going to rewrite the Bible in English. And so they rewrote the Bible in Shakespearean English. And this piece of shit, this writing on toilet paper, the King James Bible, is what Americans say is the most holy book of the Bible. This is their Bible. And they say this is divinely inspired. They say that these men from Oxford and Cambridge who were working under orders of the king were divinely inspired, like the prophets of old. They are up there with the prophets. They're like Virgil, man. They're up there and they rewrote the word of God in English. And the reason that this is holy is because English is the most spoken language in the world. That's why God knew English was going to be the most spoken language in the world. So this King James Bible is that holy Bible, which is meant for everyone in the world. Well, you stupid piece of shit. The most spoken language in the world ain't English. It's Chinese. More people on earth speak Chinese. Specifically, my dialect, Putonghua Guoye, Mandarin Chinese, then speak effing English, you dumb son of a bitches. So all you people out there are full of shit. Just like your English Bible is. So all of you got to come to grips with the fact that you're a bunch of Satanists who are using a false piece of work written by a bunch of bloodthirsty barbarian kings. And they misinterpreted something out of Latin from the original Syriac, which not even the Latins touched for hundreds of years. And now you're getting the real scoop. That's how misguided you've all been. And you're resting the fate of your eternal soul on this. This is how stupid, crazy, psychotic you are. Now, what's the authority for the revelation of the Magi? The biblical authority for the Magi's book was Seth. Not Seth of Colonel Michael Aquino, because all Michael Aquino is doing is a satanic inversion of a full name known as Sethin. Sethin was the Egyptian god of darkness, plague, pestilential foreigners, wars, an anti-god, a demon incarnate who fought against Osiris and the other gods of Egypt. Whatever you say about how hard it is on the eyes, with all the CGI, the original gods of Egypt film, by that I don't mean original as in anything original about it, is true to a large extent to Egyptian mythology and cosmology. So in that movie, Gods of Egypt, which is panned by the critics, the one thing that cannot be denied is a fairly accurate rendering within cinematography of the conceptualization of the ancient Egyptians of Seth, Sethan, his full name, and Osiris. Now, calling him Set is like kind of referring to Lord God Jehovah, Yahweh, as Joe. That's like going up to our divinity instead of, I don't want to pronounce Jehovah or Yahweh, so I just call him Yo or Joe. That's what they did to Sethan. Sethan, of course, is where we get the term Satan. So Sethan existed long before there was, of course, a Christianity exploding as a global phenomenon. And Seth is, of course, the diminutive of his full name for the sake of confusion, so that all of you are confused as to what is right and wrong. Just like the pentagram is a Christian symbol. It was known as the symbol of forthrightness by the ancient Jews. It became a Christological symbol because it represents the 5 wounds suffered by Christ on the cross. So the pentagram, in a northern pointed variant, is the symbol of Christ and is used as a ward to ward off demons. The inverted cross is the sign of the Roman Catholic Church because it is the cross of St. Peter. St. Peter felt himself unworthy to be crucified in the same manner as his God, Jesus Christ, Mashiach the Anointed. So he asked the Romans to crucify him upside down when they ordered him executed, and they relented and granted him his wish. Since that time, the inverted cross is the St. Peter's cross. The inverted cross is what is carved into the stone throne of the Pope of Rome. So, of course, all the Americans today, in their ignorant infantilism, look at that and say, see, the Pope of Rome is a Satanist because it's an inverted cross. The majority of Christians, for hundreds of years, wore inverted crosses as a sign of their humility before God, because they would never hold a cross upright, which would show them to be arrogant and presuming themselves on the level of God himself, something they would never do. So all Christians wore inverted crosses for hundreds of years. The cross of St. Peter. You people don't even know your symbols, you don't know your works, and you don't know that Adam and Eve had a third son, the righteous son of Adam, named Seth. Now, it's through Professor Landau's translation of the Revelation of the Magi that we have Seth's prophecy. The righteous third son of Adam went to China because, of course, he didn't want to commit incest by sticking around and marrying his sister. So it was there Seth's prophecy was told to the Chinese martial artists, the Christian versions of Shaolin monks, that a star of indescribable brightness will someday appear, heralding the birth of God in human form. Adam had told Seth that the star had stood over the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, but it had disappeared when Adam ate of the tree of knowledge. In the Revelation of the Magi, through this lost tale of the wise men and their journey to Bethlehem, the Magi are described as an ancient mystical sect descended from Seth himself, the pious and virtuous third son of Adam and Eve, and from Seth they inherited a prophecy, a star of indescribable brightness, someday appearing and heralding the birth of God in human form. The same star had initially hovered over the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. This may be connected with a very powerful tradition that the cross on Golgotha was actually the tree of life. One of the Magi had a vision of a redemptive lamb hanging on the tree of life. And that brings us to the whole story of Eden itself. Most importantly, of course, my own late and sainted mother, who was both Chinese and Japanese. I'm only 25% Chinese, 25% Japanese. My mother was half Japanese, half Chinese. Her father was Chinese, not her mother, but her father. And her mother was Japanese. Now, that at the time was like a black man marrying a white woman in the days of the Jim Crow laws, or even in the days of slavery in the Deep South. That was like a free black man who had purchased his freedom marrying a white woman. It was like a Jew marrying an Aryan in the time of the failed Reich under the establishment of the Nuremberg race laws. But my mother's father was considered so important that the Japanese allowed him to marry a Japanese woman in Tokyo, the capital of the Japanese Empire itself, where the emperor himself sat and ruled the empire, because her Chinese father was one of a long line of generational descendants from Set, the third son of Adam, and his intermarriage into China. He was part of what was known as the Sons of Set, these very magi cults of warrior monks who preserved the tradition of the Christ. And, of course, knowing this, the Japanese felt him to be more than worthy of marrying a Japanese woman in the capital of Japan at the height of empire. That was the descendants of the original SS, the Sons of Set, from which my mother and her bloodline was derivative. That brings us to Eden itself.